Today, we are talking everything you want to know about Quant. And our slides are now going to get real pink and full of GIFs because that's the kind of Spotify way to do things. My name is Alex Breslav, as Colette mentioned, and this is Marina. Oh, yeah, I want to share the mic. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Alex. And you'll be spending the whole day with us. So we wanted to take a moment to introduce ourselves, to share a little bit more about ourselves. I'm based in Philadelphia, and about 90 minutes south of here, for those that are less familiar with East Coast geography. I love this GIF because it's from a 2018 SNL skit about the Super Bowl. And if Philly is known for anything, it is Tina Fey, American history, and super aggressive sports fans. A little closer to the mic. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay. All right. Before starting at Spotify, Colette mentioned that I was down in North Carolina doing my PhD, designing kind of weird experiments like this, where I was having people choose between slot machines and either winning money or literally winning like M&Ms and bites of food, and analyzing that kind of flow of behavior and those flows of choices to understand people's motivations, people's goals, and literally their decision processes. And so now at Spotify, I spend a lot of my time doing effectively the same thing, looking at how people move through the Spotify app and trying to understand what they're trying to do and what we are doing well and what we need to change. And so I kind of focus, if we're thinking back to that set of quadrants, I focus a lot more in that top left quadrant, looking at user log data. So I always like to say I kind of like think like a user researcher, but I act day to day a lot more like a data scientist. So I'm going to pass to Marina.
Hi, everyone. As Colette and Alex mentioned, my name is Marina. I'm a user researcher at Spotify, but I'm often introduced as a quantitative user researcher. And that's because of my background in quant and also my love of mixed methodology. I'm super excited to be here. I traveled all the way from Manhattan. I crossed water, and that's really big for me. My name is Marina. And I'll caveat that I'm actually originally from Boston. So after I've been up here talking for about an hour and I start saying user data, that's where that's coming from. It happened yesterday, and Alex is like rattled. So I've been at Spotify for a little over a year now. And prior to that, I actually began, as Colette mentioned, my research career at a market research and brand strategy agency. I worked with clients that were across all industries. So like healthcare, food and beverage, sports, entertainment, tech, honestly, you name it. And I've probably done research in that space or had a client in that space. So what's interesting and something that I particularly liked about starting out at an agency is I could never be the expert in the subject matter. You know, I was 24 years old. I was not going to be a healthcare expert telling healthcare companies like what they should be doing. Maybe food, but not healthcare. And so it was just that much more important to become the master or to master methodology and let the research do the talking. And so at my time there, as again, Colette mentioned, I specialize in survey creation and survey design, all types of surveys. So ANU studies, segmentation, opportunity sizing. And I did a lot of mixed methodology work, which at the time at an agency where you don't have access to the type of data that I might have now, that just meant combining my quant surveys with my qualitative findings. And so now at Spotify, I put a lot of my mixed methodology experience to good use. I spend my time talking to surveying listeners about their behaviors, their experiences, their satisfaction sentiments. And I partner very closely with data scientists and folks like Alex to actually triangulate what Colette had mentioned, triangulate their user data to that experience themselves. And I can certainly say that I made it my mission since day one to just talk more about survey work, when to use surveys with my peers, and to really push forward the strength of mixed methodology. And that is what I hope to do with you guys today as well. So with that, I'll pass it back to Alex, who's going to kick us off.
We're doing a little bit passing back and forth today. So why are we here? We're here to discuss and hopefully show you, really the purpose of quantitative user research and, the powers that it brings to mixed methodology from both of our relatively unique perspectives, sort of from, as a survey scientist, as a, quantitative user researcher, data sciencey person. But, regardless of our background or specific skill set, the purpose and our goal in Quant UR is to examine the user experience at scale, just like Colette said. Oh man, that color doesn't show up at all. There are circles around that. Okay, that's going to be a thing. Shows up really nicely on the screen. And when I think it's always important to, as a quantitative user researcher, kind of demonstrate, and I have to, kind of communicate to folks, where do I sit? What do I do relative to a user researcher, relative to a data scientist? And I like to say that often data science is sort of most focused and sort of primarily where they spend most of their time is trying to understand if something works at scale. So if we launch this feature, is it going to change our key metrics? User research is primarily interested in understanding why an experience may or may not work. And our primary goal is to link those two and start to ask and really examine why or why not something works at scale. Okay, I feel like that's so loud. All right. So let's dig into it. We have all day. So we're going to sort of set some time, set some schedules, and we've tried to break everything up to make it a little bit more manageable. So we had the day broken up into 4 parts. Part 1 will be on defining a mixed methods research approach. Part 2 will be on data and recruitment for interviews. So for those of us who were here on Monday, I think that Colette had a great answer to one of the questions, which was, if research is all about making thousands of tiny decisions, what is your favorite tiny decision? And Colette said, I really, really focus on bringing the best people in for interviews. And so we're going to talk for, I think it's like 40 minutes on like how to do that well. And then in the afternoon, so this will be after lunch, part 3 and part 4, we're really going to dig into how to create good surveys and how to start to approach hypothesis-driven analysis and approach these data. In parts 3 and 4, we'll have exercises for you all to practice those. And then for each part, what we're going to do through this kind of lecturing part of it is we're going to try to answer 3 questions. What is this thing? Why are we doing it? And how do we do it? And then last, because I think that what's so important in all of this is that we start to either see it applied to an actual example, or we start to practice it ourselves. And so if we need to practice problem. And so this is our made-up thing. There's More Music Monthly. This is our made-up feature. And we have kind of manufactured this scenario to really benefit from different forms of quantitative user research at different stages of the research process. And so you'll see us doing a little bit of simultaneous triangulation. We're doing things a little bit sequentially. We're kind of doing it all. And we'll keep coming back to the scenario throughout the day. And so I want to set the stage with that scenario, kind of run through what is going on in this world. There's no need to remember any of this or write it down. We'll give you the relevant details later on when we start to practice. And then once I've set the stage, Marina's going to come back up and start to go through research planning and sort of what is particularly important about research planning when we start to widen our scope of now using all of these mixed methods. So imagine that. Our scenario slides are going to be in blue. Imagine that we've gone back in time before the days of personalized content, when you had to walk into Blockbuster and pick something off the shelf, and the closest thing to personalized content were staff picks. And we have an app, which is aptly called Music App, and we have a product objective, which is to offer better content so that our product is more engaging for users, and so that in turn increases usage and in-app consumption. This is what we need to do. And so we've heard from our users. That shows up great on the screen. When we were looking at that picture earlier, it looked like a bunch of Cheetos, but that's a bunny with carrots representing lots and lots of choices. We've heard from our users that our music catalog can be overwhelming. And we offer hundreds of thousands of songs, but people oftentimes don't know where to start when they open the app or start to use it. And so we have this new feature that our product team has just soft launched, where they actually make a playlist for users based on their own data, and it just populates with things that we think that users will like. But we see that our soft launch results were not particularly encouraging. Engagement went up, but kind of like meh. And so then our research purpose and our point at this stage is to ask ourselves, does this feature meet user needs? Is this a strategy? Is this a product? Is this a feature that we want to double down on, or do we want to pivot? And regardless of what we decide our next steps are, or regardless of which direction we decide to go, what are the best next steps? 2 quick disclaimers before we dig in. Marina and I aren't that creative. This is all inspired by something that already exists in Spotify, but is 100% made up. This was Discover Weekly was before our time. When you get the deck, there's really cool research from 2018 that I would highly recommend checking out. And also all the data are fake. So we're going to actually work with not real data, but it's a data set that I made for you all straight from my brain. But it has the features of what I've learned user data look like, what I've learned survey data look like. So I've done my best to create something interesting and challenging. So great. Now we have a game plan for the day. We've got some fun practice problem all teed up. And now I'm going to pass it to Marina to dig into planning. Once we get all the way through the GIF, because it's awesome. Oh no, we're good. Okay, now we're on the throw. And just a reminder, this is part 1 of our 4-part day. Parts 1 and 2 before lunch, parts 3 and 4 after lunch. Okay, now I'm passing it. Marina's right behind me. There we go.
It's a great user experience right here. Awesome. So thank you, Alex. We now have our project, our research purpose, and it's time to dive in. The first thing to do is to define our approach. At this point, maybe we don't know it's going to be mixed methodology, but we do know that we need to figure out what we're going to do to answer these questions. So over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to share with you how to recognize the need for a mixed methodology approach and when to incorporate quant into your research plan. So let's start with what exactly is defining a mixed method approach. What does that mean? Well, on the simplest way of thinking about it, it's identifying our existing hypotheses and research questions in order to gauge our methodological needs and identify the best approach forward. So why am I taking the time to stand up here and teach you about defining a mixed method approach? How is this any different than defining any other research approach? Just a qualitative approach, just a quantitative approach. How is it any different? Well, the truth is it's not, but as Colette mentioned, there's just so much more now to choose from. So as you all know, all research needs careful planning. But unlocking mixed methods means you're inviting an entire other set of quantitative tools and options to choose from, which will help us get even closer to answering our questions in the best way possible. So defining a mixed method approach means not only selecting the best approach, but it also means structuring your research in a way that's going to produce the best insights and maximize and produce the best insights. And this is super crucial for quant UR and mixed methods, as I bring you back to the what, why framework that Colette spoke a little bit about yesterday and a little bit about this morning. Because based on the unanswered research questions that we will identify, it allows us to better pinpoint where each question is going to fall in these quadrants. Which, as Colette mentioned, will help to signify and signal our best approach forward. And notice how I say best approach, because you technically could answer these research questions in a qualitative way, in a quantitative way. There are many different ways you can answer these, but we are looking for the best way to answer these. So, sounds awesome, but how do you do it? So once you are given your research objective, your research purpose, we start by asking ourselves these 3 questions. What do we know? What do we think we know? And what do we need to know? These 3 questions will soon become our existing knowledge, our hypotheses, and our research questions. And in order to answer these 3 questions, our first step is to take inventory of all of the information we have surrounding our research area. So this is done by conducting a research review of your past work and by conducting stakeholder interviews. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a research review is, it's looking at any relevant project work that can help provide information about that space. So that could be looking at foundational research, that could be looking at an audience segmentation, that could be looking at other market research, or it could be talking to someone on your team or a different team who has done work in that space. And for those of you unfamiliar with a stakeholder interview, maybe this one's a little bit more intuitive coming from the qualitative space, but it consists of speaking with key stakeholders for whom the work will be impacting and asking them their objectives, their expectations, and their hypotheses. As you are doing this, you are taking note of what do you know? This will become our existing knowledge. It is information that is already known and already proven. And based on the amount of existing knowledge we will have at this phase, it will either help us determine the need for more exploratory or foundational research upfront, or it could possibly lead to some of our hypotheses. You're also taking note of what you think we know. These are potential explanations gathered from key stakeholders or extracted from our existing knowledge. Our hypotheses, information that we believe to be known, but is still unproven. And the amount of hypotheses generated at this stage will also help us understand if we are in need of more exploratory or foundational research. It will help us understand if we're ready to go right into validation, or do we need to learn a bit more about why something is happening first. And lastly, you're taking note of what we still need to know. And you're doing this by breaking down the project objective into more granular questions, by recognizing the gaps in our knowledge we have in our existing knowledge, and compiling the questions asked of our stakeholders. And these three things, plus a little bit of prioritization, will lead us to our research questions. This is information that is unknown and unproven. So, first step, we have our existing knowledge, our hypotheses, and our research questions. Great. What do we do with it? The next step is to determine the methodology needed to best test our hypotheses and best answer our research questions. And this brings us back to our what, why framework. Because based on those research questions that are unanswered and the types of questions that our hypotheses are answering, we'll want to identify where each one of those falls, again, in these quadrants. So you can do that by asking yourself, as Colette alluded to earlier, what is happening or why is it happening? What is the simplest way that we are looking at our research questions? Is our research question asking us what is happening or why is it happening? And placement of each of our questions will lead us to the best methodologies to use in answering each individual research question or testing our hypotheses. Kind of like giving you the puzzle pieces, but what we're not ready to see yet, we have each of our individual pieces, but we don't know how this is all going to come together and show us the full picture. So next, we need to determine the order of our approach. And especially as it relates to the bottom two quadrants here, the attitudinal space. One of the biggest misconceptions I've seen in my time doing research is this idea that people just are ready, think that they're ready for a survey. They prematurely think that, it would be great to prove our insights at scale. Let's do a survey. But more times than not, that is not the case. You're not quite ready for a survey. Because to be ready for a survey, you have to be in this middle area here, where there is known information, but there is still unproven information. Most times, as researchers in a research project, we find ourselves in this space here, all the way on the right, where we have unknown information and unproven information. Because when you think about surveys, surveys are best used for validating hypotheses or proving them wrong. But in order to do that, you need to ensure you have enough information on the topic to even generate your hypotheses, to write your physical survey. A survey is a set of predetermined questions. So if you don't have the information to include in your survey, you're not going to magically have a new answer pop out of nowhere. Everything you get out of a survey, you put into it yourself. So all of this to say is if you are limited in your hypotheses and you're limited in your existing knowledge that might lead to your hypotheses, you likely need to start with qual to gather a little bit more information, build your groundwork, build your survey, and then utilize a survey to test them later. So in this step, what we are doing is comparing the amount of existing knowledge we have and the amount of hypotheses we have, our known information. And we're comparing it to our unknown information, our research questions. And based on the amount of unknown information to known information, that relative amount, it will help us identify if we need to do more brainstorming and more understanding of the space, or if you're ready to go in and validate, to quantify, to put to scale what you're trying to test and prove. Thus, kind of bringing all of our puzzle pieces together in a way that you can now see the full picture. But we just have to color in the actual puzzle with all of the research we're about to do. So, a lot of information. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like now in the scenario that Alex just talked us through. So as we mentioned, we were given our research objective. We have this feature, and we want to see if it's meeting our users' needs. We want to see if it's as successful as we thought it would be. And if it's not, what do? We need to learn what we're going to do. So we've conducted our research review and spoke to our stakeholders. And we've identified these 4 research questions through recognizing the gaps in the information that we already knew, through breaking down that original objective into smaller questions, and by talking to stakeholders. And so next we ask ourselves, we're looking at each of our individual questions, and we ask ourselves, what are we really trying to answer? If you look at research question 1, which is up here in the top left, does it increase usage and in-app consumption? By how much? Is that a question of what is happening, or is that a question of why is it happening? By asking yourself that, and you don't necessarily have to physically put it on a plot. I'm a very, very visual person. I find this helpful, but it's just a way to think through it. Compared to our research question 3, why does this feature increase or fail to increase engagement? Now we're trying to understand the why there. That falls more into our qualitative space. It's more of an attitude. What is our user thinking, not what are they doing? And so we go through each of our 4 questions, and we try to determine, again, not how do we answer this question, how can we answer this question, but what is the best way to answer this question? And as we go through, we start to recognize what we have, what we know, what we need to know. In this case here, we're recognizing, okay, well, we have, why does this feature increase engagement? It could be because of awareness, it could be because of satisfaction, it could be because of drivers or maybe pain points. We don't necessarily know what any of those are, but we might have those as our hypotheses. And so again, we're just going through, we're saying, okay, we still need to know the why here, so we're gonna start with qualitative research. But we do have some information, potentially hypotheses. It could be because people aren't aware, it could be because people are satisfied or not. Let's learn more about that. So by starting with maybe a recruitment survey that answers some of those questions, it could help us to hone in on who we're gonna talk to. And our 4th research question, what are we gonna do about it? That tells me that not only do we need to know the why, because we need to know what people are thinking, but then we also need to prioritize it a little bit and know how many people are thinking that. So while we might start with qualitative research here, we're gonna end with a survey to validate it. And altogether, all of those individual questions come together in a research plan. So ultimately, we've identified the questions we can answer up front with just looking at data. We've identified the questions we'll need to explore through qualitative research before moving into any validation or trying to prioritize it. We've recognized that there might even be some questions that we need to ask in order to make sure that we're talking to the right people in these qualitative interviews. And lastly, we've recognized that after we have all of this information, we need to make it a bit stronger to know exactly what to do with it. So we'll need a survey to prove it at scale and to validate it a bit more. All of this to say that we have our research plan ready to go. And the last thing I'll say before I pass it over to Alex again is if you look at these, we have our recruitment survey. That's a short period of time. Our qualitative interviews, a specific period of time. But our user log behavioral analysis, which Alex will be talking through, I will not be talking through that, that continues to go through the entire way. So again, always having access to that data. It's just pulling all of this together. So a lot of information. Just to kind of wrap it up in a quick summary, your first step to do is take inventory of your information, establish your hypotheses and your research questions, as well as your knowns and your unknowns, and use the why, what framework to plot your hypotheses and your research questions to help establish your methodology. Then evaluate the ratio of knowns to unknowns to establish your approach order, and your full research plan. And that takes us through defining a mixed methodology approach. Something far more complicated, but hopefully I've simplified it a little bit here. But yeah, we can take some time if anyone has questions now before moving on.
Here, I can.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of your, I think it was the second research question. It was like, is this, I don't remember exactly. Is this beneficial to some users but not others? So like, I don't think that's somewhere that like my brain would naturally go. Are you always looking to like segment who it benefits? Is it almost like, do you have a question bank or something?
So great question.
Yeah.
If I can remember from the top of my head, the question is around, question one is just, is this increasing or decreasing? Question two was, is it different for some people but not others? So for me, that's still something that we are looking at kind of like what is happening. If you take away the some people, not others, what's the action still of that question? So it's still, is it increasing for some people or not others? So recognizing that it's a behavior, because it's talking about are some increasing, are some not, which kind of brings you to the top of that scale. Where and again, it's not as black and white as, are you a what or are you a why? And as I mentioned, you can really answer these questions qualitatively too. It just won't be as close. It won't be as good of research. And that it tells me that it would be a behavior, which would more likely be better answered by Quant. And it's just a subset, essentially the next step of that first question. Yeah.
I think what's a little bit important too here is our context, because we work at a consumer-facing company where we have hundreds of millions of users. Oftentimes when we change something, it's, something's going to change somebody somewhere somehow, always. And so we need to often parse whether what we're doing affects a lot of people or affects some people or affects nobody. Actually, it never affects nobody. It never affects everybody, and it never affects nobody. It's literally impossible when we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. And so part of it is just the scale at which we work and the scale at which we have to consider how our product changes and interacts with our, interacts with our users.
Thank you for the great presentation, both of you. My question is regarding the sample size, because yesterday we talked about the qualitative methodology that until we reach the saturation, we continue the data collection. But about the mixed methodology, I'm wondering, mostly about the quantitative phase. How much participants generally do we need? I know that it might be different from topic to topic. And the second question is about, do we use the same participants for both phases? Is it something necessary to do, or it doesn't matter? Do we collect data, the quantitative from some participants and then qualitative from others? Thank you.
Great question. Do you want to take the sample size? I can do the second one.
I wonder if this question is best served in the examples. Yeah? Where we can walk through some of the sample size considerations?
Yeah, I mean, we don't dive too much into the sort of statistics of the survey size. I think that there are certainly rules of thumb for choosing a survey sample size. The most sort of robust way to do it is to do something called a power analysis, which basically you ask yourself, what's the most important question that you need to answer? And given that most important question and the statistical test that you need to use in order to answer that question, you can then, use an estimator to say, okay, I want to be 80% sure that if this effect exists in my data, and I think it's going to be a small effect, because oftentimes surveys are small effects, then I need N users. I need 300, I need 400 users in that comparison to make sure that I can see it. But there are rules of thumb.
Yeah. And like a rule of thumb that I've always gone off of is I'm comfortable, probably the lowest amount I am ever comfortable surveying and reading the amount is 50 people. But with that comes the margin of error is going to be much higher. That's something that I think Alex could probably talk more about than I can. And also, if you're trying to prove significance, it's going to be a lot more difficult with a smaller sample size. I would say I'm even more comfortable with 100 people. But again, 50 is as low as I will ever go. I will, at that point, in anything 100 or less, I will caveat to my, whether it's clients, whether it's stakeholders, that this is a low sample size. Something that's important, though, is kind of to what Alex mentioned, is if you know you're going to be looking at individual groups, very rarely are you only going to be looking at the total audience. So you also need to ensure that if the group that you are interested in or might be interested in, you're going to have at least 100 people. If you do want to kind of slice and dice your data. And then your second question was around, yep. So that's a great question. And that goes back to a lot about what Colette had been talking about with the simultaneous triangulation. In this case specifically, if we go, can you go to the research plan? Yeah. In this case here, we're able to look at the data of everyone that's involved in these steps. But when you are bringing a survey into the research plan, very rarely have I resurveyed anyone here. And the reason for that is because if they've gone through these steps, their answers are going to be completely different here, or risk being different or biased if they've now gone through a lot of the other research. So I try not, unless I'm going through the approach of, maybe we're doing a diary study and we're looking at their data along the way. I think when you're looking at user data, you can certainly look at the users that are involved in these steps. I will also add, and this is just a tiny tidbit, but for example, if you're looking to survey with an A/B test, because when you're surveying, it's a much larger sample size. If you're taking people out of the A/B test and you're conducting qualitative interviews, that's going to be at most 10, 12 people. That's not going to impact your A/B test. But if you're surveying thousands and thousands and thousands of people, that could then start to have an impact on your A/B test. So those are just steps that it might not be a simple answer. It's going to be the classic, it depends on what you're trying to do. But that is something that I've seen happen to people before, is that when you start to work with much larger amounts of people, it starts to have impact on the rest of the research you're doing. So something just to keep in mind there as well.
Can you help maybe set a framework for what is a hypothesis versus what is someone's gut reaction to a research question? So if you have a research question and someone says, well, what if we try this? That's now a hypothesis. Let's test it. How, as a researcher, would you push back on that or set a threshold for maybe we don't know enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, again, if you are extracting a hypothesis from the existing information you already have, then maybe you feel a bit more confident that there is reasoning behind that. If it's someone that doesn't have a lot of information and they can't explain why they think it could be the case, I would actually call that more of a gut reaction and potentially not something that we're going to go right into validation with. But what you should be doing then is, if that's something you hear again in the qual interviews, so kind of the reason why we do structure it this way is we start up here saying, what do we know? What do we think we know? What do we need to know? And we do that same exercise to an extent down here again after qualitative interviews. If you're talking to one of your key stakeholders who has been in this business for years and years and years, it's likely that their gut reaction might be based more on something they've seen before. They're extracting it from something that they are familiar with. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about on day one about building the trust and having those relationships with your stakeholders. If you know the person, if you know the amount of information that is on the other side of that gut reaction, then you can kind of make the decision there. But it's always okay as a researcher to say you know what, I don't think we know enough yet. Because when we get to the survey writing section of today, you will notice when you are writing out all of your questions, if you can't fill out a close-ended question of all of the punches, then you weren't ready to ask that question for validation because you don't have enough there to try to have proved it.
So for the next 40-ish minutes, something like that, we're going to be talking about data and recruitment for interviews. And I picked this GIF because a lot of this is about finding the best people to bring in for qualitative interviews to ensure that our research is efficient and we're making the most out of our time. This is part 2, halfway, or not halfway. We're at the beginning of halfway. And during this section, we really want you to learn how to leverage a kind of small, what we're calling a recruitment survey, an exploratory data analysis to set the rest of our research up for success. And so what is this? It's baseline research that will guide your choices for qual and quant analysis later on. And this is kind of, we love this step because it is small relative to what the whole afternoon is going to be. But what's so valuable here is that we're going to be able to gather the lay of the land of precisely sort of what's going on, what our users are doing, the kind of gut reaction to how they feel about it, that's going to inform every step through the rest of our research process. So why are we doing it? More specifically, it's 2 things: to figure out who to talk to and to capture early insights. And if we look at that first step, or first part, figuring out who to talk to, there are kind of 3 pieces to this. The first is efficiency. We want to ensure that if we're taking the time to schedule somebody and bring them in and to talk to them for an hour, they're going to give us valuable insight and relevant feedback so that we're not wasting our time. The second is accuracy. If we have user log data accessible and we can, query it and start to learn about our users and what they're doing, that gives us a source of truth. Participants could tell us one thing and then do something completely different. And then when we come in and interview them, they're not particularly helpful. And last, we want to talk to a variety of users. And what I think is so, so important here is that this isn't just about demographic diversity. This isn't just getting, users that have been on the platform for a long time versus some that are brand new, getting some people from cities versus some from other parts of the country. We want to capture users that also engage with our app or with our feature differently. And then our second goal is to capture early insights. And so what's great is this whole process of figuring out who we want to talk to try to, focus on efficiency, accuracy, variety. We're going to learn a lot about our users and learn a lot about our feature just from these initial steps. So we can gather that lay of the land, affirm the basics, provide high-level perceptions, and then what this kind of allows us to do, or what this facilitates, is getting investment from stakeholders early on. This whole process that Marina laid out is not short. The research process is slow compared to the product development process. But this can give us an opportunity to give something back to our stakeholders relatively quickly, whether that's in the form of user data or in a little bit of a little insight nugget from a survey. So how do we do it? This is all great in theory, but let's start to dig in to what this actually means in practice. What this is going to look like is a short recruitment survey, which Marina is coming up because this is the transition slide. Marina is going to come up and talk. And then I'm going to dig into exploratory data analysis.
All right. Okay. So let's talk about a recruitment survey and how to write one. So no matter the size of the survey, whether it's super small for recruitment purposes or if it's for validation and analysis purposes, you always want to start by addressing the objective and its needs. Always the first step. So what are we doing? We've defined our recruitment criteria already. So we know the metrics that we want to talk to people that they fall into one way or the other. But what we need to do is identify which metrics cannot be defined by user data. And then we're going to prioritize these metrics as content questions in a very short survey. So the key to writing a successful recruitment survey is that we're keeping it short and simple. We're not analyzing our entire research objective here. We are capturing a subset of information through 3 to 5 content questions. And I'll add a little bit more detail about what I mean by content questions in 1 second. And then we're using a handful of other questions to aid our recruitment process. And we'll talk through those shortly as well. So these content questions are perceptual or contextual information that cannot be defined through user data. So what I mean by that is if we want to talk to someone who has used our feature, Yes, I could use a content question to say, have you used this feature? Or which of the following features have you used? But that's going to be self-reported. I don't know to what extent they've used it. They might be lying for all we know. That is information that we can gauge by looking at their user data. But what we can't do is tell whoever's not using it, who's aware of it, what percentage is aware of it. We can't tell how satisfied they are with it or how unsatisfied. We can't tell what other competitors they're using. This is all information that we do have to hear from our participant. So these are the types of questions that we would want to include in our survey at this step. These types of questions, and I know today is not about stakeholder management. I know it's going to go a bit more into detail about that tomorrow, but as Alex did allude to, these types of questions also kind of double as good opportunities for opportunity sizing or good opportunities for sharing just like little nuggets of data with your stakeholders to kind of allow them to just nibble on this information while we gear up for our larger, meatier analysis. So being able to say the percentage of people that are aware of the feature, being able to say that awareness is not one of the reasons why it might not have as high of usage as we thought. And so for the purpose of just this session right now, or this part of the session, we're going to talk through writing successful performance KPI questions. So these are questions like awareness, and it's questions that are scaled questions. So I'll talk through how to write a scaled question, which typically tend to be satisfaction, consideration, performance KPIs that are commonly used in this phase of our research. And then this afternoon, we'll be talking through how to write kind of like a larger survey with sharing best practices there, which will cover more of like these types of questions over here on the contextual side. So before we dive into the lesson, let's start with a little pop quiz here. And I have, I believe 4 of these. But we're trying to gauge awareness of Music App. Which of these 2 will give us more accurate results? So on the left, we have which of the following services, if any, are you aware of? We list out YouTube, we list out Spotify, we list out Music App, Pandora. And on the right, we ask, are you aware of Music App? Yes or no. So show of hands for those of you in the room. If you believe it is, and I have to like look at my hands. If you believe the correct answer is that A will give us more accurate results, raise your left hand. If you believe it is B, raise your right hand. If you think it is both and that they're equal, raise. You can wave too, but. Okay. We got Alex waving in the corner. All right, so survey says, I'm not gonna tell you yet. I'm gonna give you a little bit of lesson first. So when writing awareness questions, and this will allow you to then decide if you wanna change your answer or not. When writing awareness questions, the goal is obviously to gauge the most accurate sense of awareness. But in order to maximize for accuracy, we need to write our questions in the most non-biased and non-leading way. And I will be talking about non-biased and non-leading language all day. So this will be a huge theme as we talk about survey writing. And a good way to think about this, a good way to know if you are kind of biasing your survey taker is your survey taker should not be able to guess what the correct answer is. In this case, they should not be able to guess what company I work for and what I'm doing the research for. So let's look back at the questions. Looking at the question on the left, realistically, could you guess like who I worked for, who was I interested for? If you did, it'd be a really good guess. On the right side, are you aware of Music App? Most likely, you could probably guess who I'm interested in here, what service I'm interested in. So thus saying that those who said A will give us the more accurate results here because it is, B is running the risk of biasing our survey taker, wanting them, people tend to want to agree with you. They want to seem favorable, pleasant. They want to say yes, not no. The same goes for when we're asking about awareness of a particular feature or product. Below is a list of potential or existing features. Which of the following, if any, are offered by Music App, as opposed to just saying, are you aware of this feature? So now let's look at writing scaled questions. We'll start with the question text and then we'll go into writing the scale. Looking at our next exercise, we're trying to gauge satisfaction in Music app. Which question is best for gauging satisfaction? How satisfied are you with your listening experience on Music app? Or how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your listening experience on Music app? Left hand for A, right hand for B. Both hands for both. Okay. Survey says I will do another lesson. So when writing a scaled question, similar to awareness, in pretty much any question you're ever going to write in a survey, you want to avoid using leading language as much as possible. So the way we frame each question has a subconscious consequence in how our survey is reading that question. So even by asking how satisfied are you is insinuating that there is in fact satisfaction. And then even the smallest tweaks in language can help in evening that playing field in the respondent's mind who's reading the question. So when we look back at our question here, by saying how satisfied or dissatisfied are you, it invites the possibility that our respondent could be satisfied or they could be dissatisfied. And it's evening the amount that each of those words, the impact that each of those words has on how they're going to answer, and thus eliminating any bias. Now we're looking at writing the actual scale and how we structure them. Again, you guys know the drill at this point. If you believe the 5-point scale on the left here, that goes from very satisfied to very dissatisfied, will give you more accurate results. Raise your left hand. The one on the right, raise your right hand. If you think they are equal, raise both hands. Again, Alex. I see no one waving. Okay. So let me start by saying this is one of the more common mistakes I see when I'm reviewing a questionnaire. And again, it's all going back to mitigating bias. I'm either going back to mitigating bias or I'm going back to avoiding leading questions. Scales should always go negative to positive. And the reason being that there are two types of biases that come with the way that you structure this type of scale. The first being social desirability. And I alluded to this earlier. People want to give answers that make them look favorable. They want to appear to be pleasant. They want to be positive. They want you to like them. So you are subconsciously going to be pulled towards a positive answer. On the other side, people also, the primacy bias, people also anchor their thinking on the first response when they're taking a physical survey, thus bringing them to the beginning of the scale. So when we go back, by structuring our scales negative to positive, those two are canceling each other out and creating the best scenario for us to have accurate results. So again, looking at this here, the correct answer is B, because we are going negative to positive. If we had structured our survey, our scale like this on the left, we have some people who are answering 1 because they want to be positive. We have some people answering 1 because that is just where their attention was brought. And then we have some people that just actually are very satisfied, but it's gonna be skewed. Whereas on the right here, those two are canceling each other out, leaving the best opportunity for those more accurate results. All right, and I promise this is the last one. We're still trying to gauge satisfaction in Music app. We now have our negative to positive scales on the left and on the right. But on the left, it's a 7-point scale, and on the right, it's a 5-point scale. Which scale is better for gauging satisfaction? A, B, or both? All right, so one of the most common questions when talking about scales is how many anchor points or response options should you include? And the answer to that question is actually, this is up to you. But the answer lies in how the respondent thinks about that metric. So in this case, as long as the way that it is structured makes sense to the respondent, that is a good scale. What I will say is that people tend to lean towards 5 or 7. And the reason being that the more anchor points you do have, the more variance you'll have in your responses. And Alex will go more into that later on. But what that means in kind of the simple level is If you only have 3 points, you are more likely to have more people in each of these buckets than if you have 5 points or 7 points. I personally use 5-point scales. I find that 7 is too granular for a respondent, but that's my thinking. That does not mean that a 7-point scale is incorrect. I know a lot of people that prefer 7-point scales. So when we look back at the question, these are both very real ways that people will think about their satisfaction. As long as it's going negative to positive, and as long as you're not doing like a 10-point scale on something that should not be that granular, both of these are an accurate way to structure your scales. So I also mentioned there will be 3 useful tips, and I'll go through those really quickly. The first is I also like to include, whenever I have a recruitment survey, a question that is gauging interest for those to participate in my qualitative interviews. So I'll frame a question like at the end that's like, thanks for your response. We will be conducting follow-up interviews to learn more about your experiences. Are you interested in participating in my 30-minute interview? If they say yes, I'll do a follow-up question around best way to contact you. If I'm doing my own recruiting, my third question might be like specifically about their availability. Useful tip number 2. This is my favorite trick. I love adding this type of question into my recruitment survey. And this type of question is including an open end to gauge the type of participant you might be talking to in your qualitative interviews. So show of hands, how many people have moderated an interview in which the participant on the other end just like wasn't giving you anything? Like such close-ended responses, you're just pulling teeth at this point. Right, you never know what you're going to get. So think about this as kind of your tryout for your qualitative interview. You can go through and see their response and see, are they a detailed person? Are they adding a lot of color in their responses? Or are they just going through the motions saying, yeah, no, like just not really giving you much? It's better to find out here than it is when you've been talking to them for an hour and giving them $100. And so you never know who you're gonna get. This helps you kind of figure that out. And then lastly, and most importantly, ensure you are including a key identifier that allows you to append your survey data to your user data. I'm gonna say this again because all we are talking about today is triangulating data points. So if you can't physically connect your user data to your survey response, to your qualitative interview, then everything we've talked about loses its power. So ensure you are including some sort of key identifier that allows you to append your survey data to your user data. And these are things if you're working with a data scientist, if you're working with a quantitative researcher, they can help you with that. I would not expect you to know exactly top of mind what your company's best way to append your data is. There are lots of people who can help with that, but just a step to remember is making sure that you have that there. So with that, I'll pass it back to Alex.
3 things.
One question.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's do like one. If anyone has one question on that, because that was a lot to cover.
Yeah, what is it?
Anita.
How would you recommend recruiting for people with like neurodiverse behaviors, or getting those people who are just trying to get more like accessibility needs?
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, so when, just the second part?
Or the entire question.
Okay. So I was thinking when you're recruiting for like user interviews and you are hoping to kind of get more understanding of like minority populations who have more accessibility needs, or from like neurodiverse populations, how would you recommend kind of going through the recruit for that?
Definitely. So again, I feel like most of the questions we answer today, it's going to say it depends. As you would for any qualitative interview recruiting, at the beginning, you really just need to prioritize what metrics are most important. What I like to do is create kind of like a grid of all my primary characteristics. These are things that need to differ. And then secondary characteristics, these are things that don't necessarily need to differ. And again, like what was the prioritization quote is, you're not prioritizing until it hurts. And so you really have to ask yourself, like, what are the key differences there? And then as you go through, I will always, whether I'm doing it myself or using a recruiter, either way, I'm the one going through the data, and I'm going through only those who said that, yes, they're interested in the qualitative interviews. And I am first looking at the number one most important thing and pulling a difference there. And then I'm looking at the second most important thing and pulling a difference there. And then I kind of create it in like a sheet. It'll end up looking like a massive grid, and you start to see where your numbers fall. So I think just the first step, and when you're prioritizing your recruitment needs, that's kind of when you answer that question and have to decide, like, where am I willing to budge if I need to? And honestly, more times than not, you're going to need to. So just make sure you're asking yourself that question and keeping yourself honest in answering it. All right. I think we're going to pass it over to Alex, and then I can field any other questions. And again, there's going to be a huge thing about surveys this afternoon.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go back one slide real quick, because the whole thing, right, is about linking survey data to user log data. And that this is really a time when we're doing this kind of foundational part of it, and we're really trying to explore and gather the lay of the land, where we're doing this kind of simultaneous triangulation. I don't know why Colette had to pick such a hard word to say. And we need to ensure that the power comes from linking those data pieces. And so what does exploratory analysis of user log data look like at this moment, as we're still trying to understand the basics of the problem, understand the basics of how people are interacting with their feature, interacting with their product. And I want to caveat here that this is a perfect time to start digging into the data, but I kind of take that for granted. I recognize that it's a privilege to have the data that I have at Spotify, because, just because you have a product and just because engineers can theoretically track what folks are doing and provide those data to you, we have entire teams of engineers, data or analytics engineers and data scientists that manage and maintain those data, that then I can be like, cool, what's going on? I don't have to do any of the earlier parts. And so it's not trivial to be able to do this at a company, or if you're building a research team. But if you have access to it, or you can advocate for it, I would, because it makes such a huge difference. But let's assume you have it, and let's see how we can leverage it. So what I think is really important when we talk about exploratory data analysis is that we're just figuring out what's going on in general. We are not doing fancy statistics. We are not hypothesis testing. We are not, cutting our data up into a million subgroups to like check every angle of what could potentially possibly be going on. All we are doing is looking primarily at a single variable at a time, just one at a time. And we are looking at descriptive statistics and histograms. We are just looking at the basics. But what's very important, and what I'll really dig into, is that the basics are usually like 80 to 90% of where all of that information is held and where all that value is. So let's talk about descriptive statistics. So descriptive statistics are just giving us a basic overview of what's going on. One way that we can visualize descriptive statistics is just look at a table. I'm doing this in Python and in JupyterLab, but you can do this in Google Sheets. There's actually, I just figured out that if you go to the bottom right, there's this little tab that says Explore, and you can just type in like histogram or table of this thing that I want, and it just pops up. It's crazy. But you can pull the count, mean, standard deviations pretty quickly in Google Sheets on any one of your columns. And what we want to be looking at, again, is just one variable at a time. So here I'm pulling days active, so number of days that a user came into the app for 30 days after we launched our hypothetical feature. So what can we learn from each one of these statistics? The first is just counts. So at the top, we have our count. It says 20,000 with a bunch of decimal points that are useless. But we have 20,000 rows in our data. And what that is telling us is basically that we're not missing any data, which is great. Because a lot of, I forgot to emphasize that we have 20,000 users. And we have 20,000 users with 20,000 data points on user engagement. And unfortunately, when we're doing quantitative analysis, at this phase or any phase in the future, data cleaning and data processing is always going to be part of that. And the quickest way to ask, to ensure that your data aren't a hot mess, or that you're missing a lot of things that you thought you had, is just to look at the counts. The second part of this is statistics of central tendency. which just kind of tells us what's most typical, either behavior, what's the most typical experience. And the two numbers that we look at for that are the mean and the median. The mean here being 5.85, the median down here, which is 2. The difference, I guess what's important, in this table they are different, and we'll go a little bit more into why that's the case here, and when we would sort of prefer the mean versus the median at this moment. But the second kind of like large set, and this kind of contains most of them, is statistics of variability or variance, and sort of what the spread of our data look like, what the spread of our days active post-launch look like. And so I'm going to ask, I think is kind of a challenging question. Where's Colette? I told Colette I was going to quiz her. She's got a... So I want to ask, this is a little exercise. We have two statements here, and I want to ask you all which one you think is true. And I would love if you all kind of took a minute or two and conferred with the people around you and chatted about whether you think that the number of users that came in app once is greater than the number of users that came in app 5 times. Or the converse, the number of users that came in app once is less than the number of users that came in app 5 times. There are 20,000 users. They're all represented in these data right here. And looking at that table, do you think that A is true or do you think that B is true? Somebody just shouted out. Histogram. You made a histogram in your head. And I think that what you pointed out is great, is that you don't know that you were right. That is true. But you are right. And the logic was spot on. The fact that when we look at these numbers, 50% of people either came in 0, 1, or 2 times. So that means that the buckets, just like just like you had in your head, the buckets of people that came in 0, 1, or 2 times are much more likely to be much bigger than all of the buckets of people that came in 3, 4, 5, all the way to 30 times, because that's the rest of the 50% of data. But I think this is good exercise because technically the right answer exists in this table, but we don't know that we're right, and it took us like 5 minutes to get there. And that's the beauty of histograms. Because tables are great, we can pull them really, really quickly, but we as humans can consume so much more information in a visual way than we can looking at a specific table. And so if there's one thing that we walk away from this, sort of all of the quant analysis piece, is that you value and is that you value and feel confident looking at, reading, and hopefully, can visualize. It's pretty easy to do in Google Sheets, to be honest. Visualize histograms. So what I want to do real quick is explain the axes here. So on the y-axis is the number of users. So this is the number of users that fall into any one of these buckets. And on the x-axis is the days that a user could come in app. And so what's really important when we visualize our data with histograms is that we show all of the possible outcomes on our x-axis. So because we're looking at 30 days worth of data, the minimum number of times that a user could come into app is 0 times. And the maximum number of times that a user could come into app is 30 times. And what I think is super, super important is that even if you look at all of your data and the max is 22, you should still show all 30, because you want to show that there are 0 people who came in app 23 to 30 times, because then you might ask yourself, what is going on? And so if we actually put our data onto our plot, what each one of these bars represents is a bucket of users. So this bucket of users all the way on the left came in app exactly 0 times. The bucket of users all the way on the right came in app exactly 0 times. And the height of the bar represents the number of users that fall into that bucket and did that thing over the past 30 days. Can someone tell me, if I were to stack all of these bars on top of each other, what they would add up to? Good, 20,000, excellent. If you stacked all the bars on top of each other, which would represent all of our users, the height and the number of users that would count for is all 20,000. So we're just splitting our users up into those buckets of what exactly they do. And what I think is so valuable about histograms is they contain all of the information that our table did, but they contain it in one very quick, concise visualization where we can get all of that with a glance. We can know for sure that more users, 0, 1, more users came in app once than they did 5 times instantly, as opposed to like, I think maybe based on that, And like, I'm not sure, but probably. And so we can look at central tendency. We can see the mode, which is the most common outcome. We can look at what's typical, which, excuse me, in this case, is really best represented by the median. And I said that I was going to go into this a little bit earlier. And the reason that I'm showing the median here is because the mean or the average tells us what's most typical when our data are normally distributed, which is a pretty sort of strong assumption that we have to make about our data. And a lot of times, particularly with user log data, it doesn't look normally distributed at all, which is that kind of classic bell-shaped curve. It looks more like this. And when data look like this, if the mean is 9, that doesn't really tell me what's most typical or the most typical user experience when we account for everybody. Whereas the median, which is 2, in my mind aligns much better with what our typical user experience is, which is most commonly 0. And so and 2 kind of represents the spread a little bit, in my mind, better than the mean does. This is a little bit sort of up to interpretation. I like medians. People rely on means more, but technically this is the right answer. We can also look at variance. And the same thing, we can look at standard deviations. We can look at interquartile ranges. Here I'm just showing the range. We can see that the most common thing, which is both the min and the mode, is never to come in app. We can also see that our users fill our entire range of possible outcomes, and that our max is every day. And last, but definitely not least, is that we can see the shape. And this is something, shape is really, really important, really, really difficult to pull out in a table, but is instantly recognizable when we look at a histogram. And let's do another quick exercise. So let's imagine that our user data we're looking at 2 different groups. And for one of those groups, the user data looks like the blue bins, or the blue histogram. And for one group of users, the bins, or the user data, looks like the gray. So again, confer with your teammates and colleagues. Do we think that the blue and gray groups have the same average or mean? Or do we think that the blue or gray groups have different averages or means? And what I really want to demonstrate here is that if we just look at things like means and ignore our histograms, ignore what the shape of the data are, then we can run into trouble because these means are exactly the same. But if our user data looked like either blue or gray, we'd have completely different stories about what's going on. If our data looked like the gray data, then we would say, okay, most people either come in app never or they come in app always. So we either get really sticky people or we get people that aren't monthly active users. Whereas if we have engagement data that look like our blue histogram, then it would kind of everything's like a 50-50 shot. People on average come in 15 days a month, but every day is a 50-50 shot. The last thing I want to point out, so we've been looking at, one variable, one user engagement, or example of user log data, but what I think is really, really valuable is to look at survey data as histograms as well. Because all the same points hold true. That we could do the same thing. We could just look at the mean response to the scale. But if we miss out on the shape, on the sort of visualization of the central tendency and of what's most common, what's least common, variability, then we could run into the exact same types of problems with survey data. Survey data is obviously much more constrained than user log data. There's only 5 possible responses. But in my mind, the best way to be looking at survey data as well, particularly at this early stage, is to be looking at the histograms and to really understand what the distribution of responses are, not just what the mean out of 5 is. Okay, so let's apply it. So let's take our recruitment survey and our exploratory data analysis and actually apply it to the scenario that we've been talking about. So let's go back to our 4 research questions. I'll give you all a sec just to soak them in again. And so if we're answering research question 1, when we went back to our original research plan, the best way to answer this was through an experiment. And at least at Spotify, and I imagine that at most companies, experiments are most often run by data scientists. And so this wouldn't necessarily be something that I do, but something that could kick off the research that we're doing. And so we might see from our experiment, there's a 3% relative increase in user engagement. And as I mentioned in the very intro, that people are kind of like, meh. Like this, there is a lift, but we're not that excited about it. Research question 2. So what I think, what I want to see in this moment, what I'm looking for in the user log data is sort of who has used this feature and how much. And what I think is very important is that when data scientists tend to run experiments, they tend to look at group means. They're doing a lot. And so the fact that they can't dig into user level analysis or look at what groups of users are doing is not their own fault. They just have other priorities. And so our priority lies in, okay, let's start to look at individual users. Let's start to look at groups of users and understand precisely what's going on so that we can start to pick that number apart. The why is something happening at scale, right? And so, if I want to understand, if people's engagement changed with the app, and maybe differently for some versus others, then basically all I do is look at histograms of usage, pre and post launch of our feature here. And so what we can see, and actually this little tidbit to our exercise later, like I can pull out, if I'm looking at user level histograms of engagement data, if there are certain groups that are changing differently compared to others. And so we could say, for example, there's bigger engagement left for light users that maybe only come in app once or twice a month versus those that came in app 27, 28, 29 days a month. They're naturally going to be harder to move. And if we look at research question 3, this is where we start to get into our recruitment survey and start to get that kind of high level gut of what's going on. And the first being awareness. So if we want to start to, again, pick that number apart from our experiment and say, okay, why is engagement not as high as our product team thought it was going to be? It could be because nobody knows that the feature exists. And really that's more of a marketing problem than it is our problem, but it's a problem nonetheless. But in our example, awareness is not the problem. 75% of respondents, going back again to kind of Marina's setup for how we think about awareness questions, 75 respondents selected the playlists that populate, this is a little bit wordy, but playlists that populate music for you based on your music interests is a feature of Music app, along with the other things that may or may not be in there. The second piece might be to get that gut level reaction to satisfaction, to see if maybe engagement is not as high because satisfaction with the feature is not as high as we think it should be. And so in our example here, 60% of respondents selected they are somewhat or very satisfied with the feature. And I think that interpretation of satisfaction questions can be contextual in my mind, because people tend to respond pretty positively because you are asking them about the product and because of social desirability, because of self-selection biases. That number is always going to be kind of high. So at least in my mind, 60% is not that great. And last, just for completeness, we have research question 4, but this is not the stage, this data and recruitment stage. We're just trying to gather the lay of the land and understand what's going on. This is not the time to be answering this question. And ultimately, I also want to point out too, I forgot to mention, that we haven't answered any of these questions. Research question 3, 2, 1 we technically answered to, but like research question 2, 3, and 4, which is really where we're digging in, we don't have complete answers to at this moment. We just have initial tidbits. We just have the sort of earliest parts of what's going on so that we can really inform what's going on later and dig in deeper in the next parts of our survey work and our analyses. And so if we turn back to our 2 main goals, figure out who to talk to and capture early insights, I think that with these data we can and theoretically have, because we made up this whole thing, done this. We can look for efficiency making sure that our users are using the feature and they're aware of it and have told us that they're aware of it. We can gather a source of truth for how they've used the feature, how they use the app, and maybe how satisfied they are. And we can also ensure that we have a variety of users, not just in terms of demographics, but also in terms of how they've used the feature and maybe how they feel about it, so that we can bring a diversity of people in, those that use it a lot and are satisfied, those that use it a lot and are not, those that don't use it that much but express satisfaction. We can start to dig into what exactly is going on there. And last, we have pulled these insight snippets too. Like our goal is to figure out who to talk to. Our goal is to gather the lay of the land. But these are things that we can then share back with our stakeholders and our product teams and say, hey, here's what we think is going on. Here's the research now that we're going to do to start to dig in more, to really get a more deeper understanding of our research questions. And we'd really like for you to, come to our interviews, observe. And here's why, because I'm already providing you great insight, even though it's light. It's just little snippets. And so then what this all leads to is our qualitative interviews, where we can get the most sort of out of each of our participants. Our research is efficient. Our stakeholders are engaged and hopefully invested in what's going on. And there's a little bonus too, that if you're sitting there as an interviewer, I've pulled a bunch of data for you, and now you have their user log data with you in the interview. You have context that can hopefully drive maybe what you're asking or what you're digging into, as well as giving context to observers or yourself as to what's sort of driving their responses. And so wrapping up, the why. So what we're doing at this moment really is to make the most out of our qualitative recruitment and our qualitative interviewing, and gather those lay of the land insights to get stakeholder buy-in. For a recruitment survey, multiple choice awareness questions are key. We want to structure scales from negative to positive, and we want question framing to ensure that we don't frame a question in such a way that there's an obvious correct answer. All of this coming back to don't lead responses in one way, don't create these biases. And the last bit for the exploratory data analysis, keep it simple. I'll repeat this over and over again. We can keep it simple and learn so much. Descriptive statistics and histograms are most of what you need. And doing this at one variable at a time, as opposed to looking at all these subgroups, is again going to give you most of what you need.
Thank you, everyone, I'm going to take it as a good sign that you came back for the afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to start by talking about hypothesis-driven surveys. For those of you, if you're just tuning in online or you weren't here this morning, my name is Marina. My colleague Alex will be taking the fourth section. And we are both user researchers, quantitative user researchers at Spotify. So as you know, during this morning's session, we talked through how to define a mixed methods approach, as well as how to leverage a recruitment survey and data to set your research up for success. So we've made it to part 3 of 4. And first, we're digging into why and how we create surveys to collect data from our users. And then followed by the fourth section, Alex will come up here and dive into quantitative analysis. So during this section, we will learn when to leverage hypotheses-driven surveys for insights, and you will also be shared 10 best practices for writing a successful survey. After the 10 best practices, we've kind of created a small exercise for you to go ahead and write a survey yourself, and then we'll talk through some of the answers to that as well. So in our format that we've been following all day, we're going to start by saying, what is a hypothesis-driven survey? It is a survey used to validate our hypotheses at scale and to provide prioritization of key learnings to help invoke action. So why are we doing this? Why are we using surveys, especially at this point in our research plan? So many people say qual answers the why question. We've talked a lot about that earlier today. We talked a lot about that yesterday. While that's true, qual is used it provides those directional insights in answering the whys of a particular behavior. I like to say it's actually the first step at answering the why, or often the first step. Qual helps us brainstorm that idea, that concept, that theme, that might help answer those why questions. But surveys can take that idea, that concept, that theme, and it can make it even stronger. It takes it one step further. It can help show them at scale, it can prioritize them, and it can estimate their impact. Thus, the two together just make for a stronger and more actionable insight. Take these findings, for example. On the left, we have, and don't worry, this isn't one of those pop quiz things that I'm going to throw you through. On the left, we have listeners want to discover new music. On the right, we have 2 out of 3 listeners will open Music app in search of a new song or artist. When thinking about which of these is stronger, maybe stronger is not the correct word, but in thinking about, which one of these would be more useful. To start, these are both very good findings. They're helpful. They tell us something new. But what the one on the right also tells us is the size of how important this driver is. Whereas we might just be learning from one person or a couple people that listeners want to discover new music. But how true do we know that is? When we see it at scale, when we can see that it's actually 66% of people are saying this, yes, we can simplify it down to say 2 out of 3, but now we know how important this is as a driver. When we talk about prioritization, say we heard from 3 users during qualitative interviews. These 3 pain points. These are things that made them not enjoy the feature as much. How do we know which one is most pressing? How do we know to the extent are these true? Is it just one person we're hearing it from, or is it 25%? There's a big difference in that. How do we know which to prioritize if we're going to recommend to our product team that we should be making changes that they're going to invest time and money in? By surveying our users and asking them these types of questions with these hypotheses that we've already learned, these down here without the percentages, these are kind of just like new hypotheses. If we can go and now prove them, test them at scale, and we can see that 36% of people say that there are too many advertisements. It's not just one person, it's not just 3 people. We're now prioritizing these from most important to least important and potentially saving our product team a lot of time and a lot of money for just going after something that one person said. What if it only impacts 5% when we could have let them know ahead of time that it was going to have a much bigger impact than that or a much smaller impact? Especially as we think of these pain points in regards to something like bettering satisfaction or bettering usage. When we start to think of them in their relationship, their correlation with a specific type of metric that we're trying to gauge, this is when surveys and Quant can allow us to see those relationships, to see which of these pain points are actually driving our satisfaction lower. This is all stuff that Alex will talk through later. But it's making it easier to see which of these changes to the features are going to have that biggest impact, are going to be worth that investment. So these are all things that by setting up a survey, we are now allowing ourselves to be able to see that type of estimated impact. We're allowing ourselves to estimate that impact in our analysis. Now, before I go and, or before Alex goes and talks about all the cool things you can do with that information, let's talk about how we actually set it up in a survey. And I could honestly stand up here and talk about how to write a good survey. I could do it for 2 hours. I'm just going to do it for 1 hour instead. But that's going to be a lot of information if I stood up here and did that. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to talk you through the 10 best practices to writing a good and successful story, or survey that will tell a good and successful story. So think of this as kind of like a survey writing 101. So the goal of writing a good survey is to capture accurate data from our respondents that answer our questions and makes it as easy as possible for our respondents to do so. So let's dive into our top best practices. And bear with me, it might get a little long. I'll let you know. I'll remind you that we're almost there. Number 1, use simple, direct, and familiar language. Each question is written for the respondent. So therefore, it should be written with their mindset in mind. This means avoid using big, complicated words. When writing a survey, you should actually be writing it for the reading level of a 7th grader. So if you can think back to your reading level in 7th grade, would you be able to understand the questions that are being asked in the survey? Avoid industry jargon. This one is huge because terminology that we use every single day that is just now second nature to you and me, it's not going to be second nature. It's not going to be as intuitive to the everyday survey taker, to the average survey taker. And if you don't know how your customers are talking about your product, and say you have qualitative interviews before this phase of research, utilize Qual to understand how they are talking about this feature, this product, this topic. Use their language in your survey. because that is how we're going to get the most accurate depiction of their experience. Repetition in survey writing is okay. I know it feels weird to us, especially when we see something written, like a question is asked and you reiterate the question in the next question. It feels weird to us, but it is okay. It's okay in survey writing. Even when it sounds repetitive to you, it's important to be explicit to your respondents, and reiterating certain points of each question will help them get in that right mindset. And then finally, bolding, underlining, italicizing, do whatever it is that you have to do to highlight these key details in each of your questions that you're asking. Because when you get to the analysis point, it is very, very difficult to be able to tell if the data you're seeing was misunderstood, if the question was misunderstood. Because there's going to be data there, but you are not in the survey taker's mindset to know that they actually misunderstood the question. So it is our job as a survey writer to make our questions as explicit and clear. And these pieces, if you're just interested in knowing about like the past month, make it known and make it obvious that you just want to know about the past month, because you will not know in their answer if they're actually talking about 6 months ago. Number 2, be specific. So some concepts can mean different things to different people. Try to be as specific as possible when asking questions, and avoid using vague language that is left up to the interpretation of our survey taker. Because that language in itself is going to need additional explanation at some point anyways. So for example, and let me start, I know we've talked a lot about scales. Let me start by saying both of these scales are fine. I've used both of these scales. So I'm not here to say like, don't use this, but there is a difference that you're gonna get out of the scale on the right than you will out of the scale on the left. And that difference is say I'm talking to, like Hanisha, say I'm talking to, you're my survey taker. If we're both survey takers of this survey, and you say, I ask you, how often do you listen to music? And you say, I listen multiple times a week. I'm gonna say that's frequently. That's frequently to you. Now say multiple times a day. That means that's frequently to you. But say I listen once a week. I think that's pretty frequent too. So I also answer frequently. Both Hanisha and I have answered frequently, but she listens far more often than I do. There's no way for us to streamline what frequently means to our respondent. There's no way for us to know what sometimes means for our respondent. But what we can know, and where there will be no confusion, is multiple times per day can only mean one thing. It only means multiple times per day. There's no way that we are going to accidentally both respond with once a week and mean something completely different. So be as specific as possible, and that will minimize leaving things up for interpretation, which could potentially risk leaving gaps in your analysis, because we don't actually know what often or what frequently means, but we do know what multiple times per day and once a day mean. Number 3, ask one question at a time and avoid using double barrel questions. So each question should just focus on one item or one question. For example, do you use Spotify to listen to music and podcasts? Yes or no? First off, as you know, don't ask those yes or no questions. But if you did, do you use Spotify to listen to music and podcasts? Now, what if I use Spotify to listen to music, but I don't use it to listen to podcasts? I'm going to have to answer no here. But we as researchers are missing key information that I still use Spotify and I still use it for this purpose. So when you're going through your survey, look for questions that use words like and words like or. There are many ways that you could kind of fix this. You could separate it into 2 questions. You could say, do you use Spotify to listen to music? Do you use Spotify to listen to podcasts? Or you could ask like, what do you use Spotify for? Music, podcasts, both, or select all. There are other ways for you to ask this that you will not be losing or missing any key information. Number 4, I promised we'd be talking about avoiding leading questions again, so we're back. So oftentimes as researchers, our opinions just seep into questions. Without even realizing it, this impacts how our survey takers respond to our survey, how they take our survey. Do your best to avoid using any type of leading language in your questions. And this is especially important in a hypothesis-driven survey, because ultimately we are looking to test hypotheses. We would love if they answered a certain way because that would prove our hypothesis. But we can't force them to answer that way because that's not good research. The framing of how we structure our language is so important. And there are 4 types of leading questions that we often see. And I'm going to talk you through those. And don't feel like you need to note what these are, but I think more the concept behind each of them is what's more important. So the first of the 4 is called assumption-based questions. These are questions framed in a way that stems from the assumption of the researcher. By asking how likely are you to use our feature, you are insinuating and therefore expressing subconscious influence that they are in fact likely to use it. Instead, by framing your question neutrally, by saying maybe to what extent is your likelihood, or speaking in a more normal way and saying how likely or unlikely are you to use our feature, you are inviting the possibility that you might be likely or you might be unlikely to use it. Now, I know that's very similar to the scale that we talked about earlier this morning, so I'll give you another example. And again, focusing just on how important the language is, even these smallest tweaks of your language can make a huge difference. So say we have a question like, which of the following are reasons why you dislike this feature? Believe it or not, but framing it that way, which of the following are reasons, insinuates that there are reasons why you dislike our feature. By tweaking the language to just say, which of the following, if any, are reasons, invites the idea that there may not be any reasons, and that's okay. That's an acceptable answer. So again, just noting the small tweaks, even the smallest of tweaks in language, make a big difference. Our next leading question is interconnected statements, which is exactly what it sounds. It's 2 statements that are closely related in creating the assumption that one is true, then indirectly asking for the agreement. So for example, asking the question, most listeners use this feature to discover new music. What do you use it for? You are priming your respondent to say they also do that. As we talked about these biases, people want to agree. They want to feel like they're doing what everyone else is doing. By structuring your question in a way that you are priming them to say, here's a really, really popular thing that people do, but like, what do you do? Just be more, just be more general. What do you use our feature for? Something along the lines that you are not forcing them to think in a certain way before they answer. Next, we have direct implication questions. Questions that allow respondents to consider the results of a possible decision they are not necessarily making. The idea that indicating that if A happens, will B happen too? This is forcing an experience that might not be true of our respondent in a way that gets you the answers that you want. So in this case, if you discovered a new song on this playlist, would you come back to this playlist? What we're really looking for is trying to see if there's a correlation between finding a song you like and your usage. Looking for these types of relationships and between behaviors and actions and perceptions, these are better off being found in the quant analysis, something that Alex will talk about next, rather than just trying to force the question here and force our survey taker to say like, yeah, I do that. Let's see if we can prove it on the back end instead. And lastly, coercive questions. As I've less subtly stated, this type of question is less subtle. This is something that you might not see in your everyday like product survey, but these are they come up in like a satisfaction survey that you might get. You like our feature, right? I think it speaks for itself as to why you shouldn't use a question of this sense. People want to agree. They want to seem favorable. They're more likely to agree with something that is affirmative than if you were to just ask the general affinity question of, how do you feel about our feature? Number 5, carefully order everything in your survey. The order of your survey questions, as well as the order of your response options, have so much power. And they have a surprising amount of effect on your results as well. The first, looking at the order of your survey, your order should flow. It should be intuitive to your respondent. You want to start broad, general category level questions if you have them. Go down the funnel, more brand specific questions, all the way to more specific feature questions. Kind of take your survey taker for that ride that makes sense to them. You're arranging the questions in an order that will be logical to respondents, but not influencing the way that they answer. It's very difficult for a survey taker to have to start here, go here, come back up here, go over there, come this way. They're going to be exhausted and they honestly might just leave. Continuing to think about the order of your questions. Be mindful of influential questions and when they are asked. And what I mean by that is that certain questions can influence how respondents evaluate questions later on. So say that, and Hanisha, I'm just going to keep using you as my example. Say that I run into Hanisha. She just realized that she lost a $100 bill. And she's like, oh, I just lost a $100 bill. And I'm like, oh, Hanisha, how's your day going though? She's like, well, I just lost a $100 bill. It's like, my day's awful. But if I was the reverse of that, I ran into Hanisha. Maybe she's had a weird day already. She's slept through her alarm clock. She stepped on a dog's paw, worst things that could possibly happen. If I was and then she found $100 on the ground. And I was like, Hanisha, how was your day? She'd be like, it's awesome. I just found $100 on the ground. So if I'm structuring my survey and I take you through which of the following, if any, are reasons you do not use this feature more, and then I list out all of the worst things you've ever experienced in our feature, but then I ask you, but how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with our feature? If you can still answer positively, I am very impressed by you as a human, because just the way that we are wired is that if I go and tell you all of the worst things about your experience and then ask you to tell me about your experience, you are going to be primed to think more negatively. So instead, make sure you are asking evaluation questions that are easily influence, easily impact, before questions that are going to influence. And maybe that's a little difficult thinking about the last slide that I just shared, go general to more specific. You kind of have to gauge the two. I would say this, in my opinion, is more important if this is the goal of your survey, if this is what you want to know. In addition to question order, how you order your response options also has impact on the results. We've mentioned this a couple times. Survey takers have the tendency to select the first option. So by randomizing the order of your responses when it makes sense to, and I'm really just going to caveat that, when it makes sense to, you are avoiding the bias that people who just inadvertently will select the first option. So, and looking at this example over here, there is absolutely no reason 1 through 8 need to be in this order. And I will also add, alphabetizing it is not a legitimate reason in this either. I know it's not alphabetized, but if it were. Things like numeric orders, things like frequencies, those should remain in the order that they are in. But something like this, where they order a categorical question, the order does not matter. This should be randomized. Because that way we are mitigating the bias that if we always show cooking first, cooking is most likely going to be higher than it would have been if it was mixed throughout. But one thing that we're doing, and keeping in mind that going back to the initial goal of a survey, part 2 of that was we're trying to make it easy for our respondent. And there's a reason for that. It's called survey fatigue. I'll get into that in a bit. So helping make this easier, if we are randomizing our order, always keep opt-outs, none of the above, I don't listen to music, other, always keep those anchored to the bottom. It's kind of like your survey taker is going to know that's where they should be looking. They're going to expect to see it there. Now, I know we're only at number 6. I promise 6 through 10 goes a little bit quicker. Alex says it doesn't, but I felt like it did. But we're almost there. Number 6, mitigate bias. That huge overarching theme I've been talking about. Bias is the sad but important reality of survey writing. And there are so many opportunities for influencing results hidden everywhere. We've talked about avoiding leading questions. We've talked about randomizing your response options, and we've talked about being mindful of your question order. We've also talked about structuring your scales. This is something I'm going to dive into a little bit again. Recapping what we talked about this morning is ordering your scales from negative to positive. It mitigates that bias of people who want to select that first option and people who want to seem favorable, answer positively. The second one of this is to weigh your scales evenly. And this is if you're using a bipolar scale. So if you're going to have positive and negative, ensure that you have an equal amount of positive responses as you do an equal amount of negative responses. So if we're looking here, we go poor, okay, good, very good, great. We have 3 positive responses. We'll say okay is neutral, and we have 1 negative response. So already you're just more likely to think more positively by reading all of those. This is again for a bipolar scale. So again, if it's going to have negatives and positives, keep that even, keep those even. Number 7, use close-ended questions. And when we say close-ended questions, we mean we're talking about questions that use pre-populated answer choices for our respondent to choose from. And so when I say this, and this goes back to kind of talking about we utilize qual to find our hypotheses. We utilize qual to take that first step of answering the why. This is the second step of answering the why, is taking what we've learned from qual and populating it into our question. And the truth is if you're writing a question and you can't think of enough response options to have a closed-ended question, if you feel like you need that question to be open-ended because you don't know enough about it, you are not ready for a survey. You should be starting with qual, and you should be learning from qual, and you should then be validating those findings later on in the survey. And the reason for this is, 1, it makes it much easier for respondents to answer. But 2, it provides you with the quantitative results that you can then analyze, that you can then see at scale, you can prioritize, you can estimate their impact. You can't do that with open ends. But if you are going to use an open end, and you might, I've used them. I gave a good example as why you might use them in a recruitment survey. There are a couple things to keep in mind. The first is that I mentioned survey fatigue. We're going to get into it more in the next slide. But open ends are tiresome. They kind of wear out your survey taker because it takes a lot for you to have to think of your own answer, think of the detail, really provide thought in a response versus just being able to select something. So if you are going to include open ends, include 1 or 2 max. You do not need more than 2 open ends in your survey. And if you do, maybe you aren't ready for a survey. And if you do include them, to the best of your ability, I would try to put them towards the end of your survey, because if you are tiring your survey taker, if there are any questions after 2 open ends, they may be more likely to either drop out at that point, or even worse, respond to questions and not fully think through them. And lastly, and this is kind of my own personal advice, is if you're going to do an open end, then do it. Let's get the most out of an open end. And so I have found myself, or found that I get the most success when I'm asking my listeners, I'm being specific about the ask, and I am encouraging them to provide details. So I know this feels like a lot to include for an open end, but the amount that you get out of this makes that question, in my opinion, worth it. So I will structure my open ends typically and say, you mentioned you do not like listening to music on Music app. In your own words, please tell us why that is. Please answer as if you were telling a friend or a family member about your experience, using as much detail as possible. Now, the way that someone asked a great question earlier today is when do you know that your open end was too much? And if you have to reread it once or twice yourself as the survey writer, maybe it's too much. But if you can keep it condensed, something like this, and are able to encourage that type of detail, you're going to get so much more out of that open end than if you just said, well, why is that? Number 8, I told you we're almost there. There's only 10. Limit survey fatigue. And I've touched on this a little bit. Keep your survey short. And if you need to, incentivize your respondents. But even when incentivizing your respondents, Surveys should not be, if they are like for product purposes, they really shouldn't be longer than 10 minutes long. And that doesn't mean that there's 10 questions, because when you think about the quickness that it could take to answer like a quick, how often do you listen to music? Here are 5 answers to choose from. Like that takes only a few seconds. But timing yourself 10 minutes is a good length of a survey for, I think, a product team or something along those lines. When I was in market research, we had 25-minute surveys, but that is a lot. I'd be the one testing it and I'd be exhausted by the end of it. So like I would feel bad for all of the respondents that are taking it. But the truth is that length can lead to survey fatigue, which means our respondents are getting tired, they're getting bored, they don't really want to be here, which then can either lead to dropout, or even worse, it leads to them finishing the survey and not really looking at any of the answers that they selected. Next is to ensure that your survey is mobile friendly. And the reason for that, and when I say mobile friendly, is if you think about like, I think this is the longest I haven't had my phone in my hand. It's because I have this thing, so I didn't notice. But so many people take surveys on their phone now. Maybe 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. But today it is. It's the reality of it. And so in taking a survey on your phone, we need to ensure that our surveys are able to do that. That means limit the amount of grids you have and limit the long lists. These just do not carry well into the mobile experience. And again, it's going to tire out your survey taker. They're going to get bored. And then third, while you should be trying to avoid long lists, I mean, this is a hypothesis-driven survey, so we are going to have hypotheses that we want to test. It might not be realistic for you to have short lists the entire time. I would recommend only including maybe like 20 response options, 22 response options max, if you ever do need to create like a full long question. And in doing that, also add selection logic. So this example over here is an example of when you'll be adding selection logic. You ask, you mentioned you do not like listening to music music on music app. Which of the following best describes why? If I allowed you to select select all that you wanted, you could go down and just select everything. Whereas asking to select up to makes you have to prioritize what some of I'd say like issues you have more often. And to figure out how many to select, I like to call it the 1/3 rule. This is kind of like my rule of thumb. It's allowing your survey takers to take up to 1/3 of the available options. So if there are 12 response options in this question, I would allow them to select up to 4. So again, that's the 1/3 rule of thumb there. And something that can help you in limiting the survey to fatigue is really take advantage of your survey and programming logic, because it will help you simplify your survey. There's absolutely no reason why you need to ask questions to people that have like no reason to be answering that question. If I want to know about your experience using my feature and you've never used my feature, why would I ask you that question? So use your survey logic so that you're only asking questions to the relevant groups. As we've mentioned, randomizing the order of questions that don't need to have any specific order. But a couple things to keep in mind while you're doing that is I always like to, and I always recommend, that you keep similar responses next to one another. And this will eliminate the respondent confusion. And what I mean by that is, say I'm asking for, what do you typically do when listening to music? And one of the options is I listen to music when I'm getting ready for bed. But there's also, I listen to music when I'm getting ready to go out. Those are two different vibes. If you're getting ready for bed, you are looking to like wind down. If you're getting ready to go out, you're not looking to wind down. And so by leaving those, if you separate the two, at this point, if your survey taker is a little bit fatigued and they're just kind of going through the motions, which is a reality of surveys, they might see getting ready and just select it. They might stop reading the last sentence. But if they see getting ready twice in a row, they're going to stop and be like, okay, so what did I select? And they're going to go back and read those two. So I always like to keep similar responses next to each other. And second is, if you are randomizing, say, the order of services at a very early question, and then you have like 3 more questions about those services, hold that order. Hold that randomized order to the next 3 questions, rather than making your survey taker have to align where they are, refine the brands that they're thinking about. This is really helpful. It's a good mental model for our respondents. And we've already talked about anchoring your other, your none of these at the bottom. All right, almost there, folks. Number 9, write with analysis in mind. Always write your survey questions with analysis in mind, as it allows you to see the full picture from the start of your research. Know what each survey question is going to answer when you're writing it. So I always like to do this as I write my survey question. Below it, I'll then write out what research question it is answering and how I plan to use that survey question to answer that research question. And on the flip side, I will have, if you remember the screen that we showed that had our 4 research questions, I will also take my survey question numbers and I will put them underneath each of those. If I do not see all of my survey questions on that piece of paper, if there is a survey question not on there, why do I have that survey question? I can remove that survey question. My survey can be shorter. And by doing it so that you're looking at each of your survey questions, you'll know that you are including everything you need to include. If you go through that sheet of paper and there's one question that is left with no response, you don't know how you're going to answer it, maybe you need a survey question that you didn't have. And number 10, we made it. Test, check, and soft launch. Once you've designed your survey, I cannot stress enough how important this is, but you need to test your survey. You need to get someone else and someone else and someone else to test your survey. You need to run dummy data, which I will explain a bit more about, and check that. And you should always soft launch before you fully launch. Imagine you fielded your entire survey. It was in field for 2 weeks, and you get your survey results back and you realize you forgot one of the most important questions, or there was some question asked in a way, or a punch didn't show, or just something was in there that completely messes up your analysis because of that one small mistake. I mean, we are all humans. You're going to make mistakes. I've made mistakes, but this process is created to make sure that you catch that mistake before it's too late. So you should test it. You should be the first person to test your survey. And when you test it, you're looking for everything. All 10, 9 things we just talked about, you're looking for all of that. You should find others to test your survey as well. Maybe after you've tested it once or twice, you should consider or continue testing it, but pull someone else in. And I like to pull someone in who is close to the material so they can look at things like logic. They can look at things kind of from the bigger picture and just make sure everything's there. But I really, really like bringing in maybe a data scientist that's not as close to the material, maybe a behavioral scientist who's not as close, someone that I've not been working closely with, and someone that doesn't work in surveys all the time, because they will be our average survey taker. And they need to be able to read through and make sure that the question and response text makes sense. They need to make sure that I'm not using words or talking in a way that they're not going to understand. And they can also check for length because they're not familiar with the survey, so they're not going to breeze through it because they haven't memorized. Always run and check dummy data. This is super important and super useful, but it is used far less than it should be. And it's a great way to measure for quality control of your data and of your survey. So most, if not all, survey platforms should allow you to run fake data. It essentially has robots just come in and take your survey for you, and it populates a ton of data randomly. So everything that will show in your survey will get populated. It makes it a lot easier for you to then pull that data file and just go through. You're not necessarily pulling percentages. You're looking at counts. You're making sure that every possible response has at least one piece of data in it. You're making sure that people who are supposed to see one question saw one question. It's a great way to ensure that all of your logic was there, because as humans, if you have like a 10-minute, 15-minute survey, it's gonna be really difficult to ensure that like every single piece of logic is correct. And if you were to miss just one, you'd most likely catch it here. And then lastly, soft launch. And by soft launch, we mean conducting a test run of your survey with a small portion of your actual audience. I typically recommend this to be about 10% of your audience, or around 100 people if possible. While dummy data is super helpful, seeing the real thing through actual like human responses allows you not only to check for logic inconsistencies, but it also allows you to kind of get like a temperature test, get a good pulse at the beginning on a few other things. The first being what your response rate is going to be, or I have IR here, your incidence rate. You get an idea for what percentage of people who received your survey are actually taking. This could impact your timeline. You might need to go to stakeholders and just say like, hey, like we're actually going to have to push it out field a couple more days. We're noticing that we're getting a slower intake. It also allows you to take a look at your sample size of crucial groups. So this morning when I was asked about like what is the ideal sample size, part of the response was, well, if there are specific groups you're going to want to look at, ensuring you have a big enough sample size to look at those people. So say I was expecting 10% of our audience to be aware of our feature, but what if only 5% is aware and then all of a sudden I don't have enough people to look at the data? It would really stink if like I realized that a week later when we were out of field and I had to go tell stakeholders then. But what I can do here instead is kind of shift my plan. I could push my timeline out and I could communicate that correctly or create some type of sampling plan in which we're doing a separate run of the survey for just that group, an oversample. It allows you to look at variance to make sure that selection logic that I talked about was the correct number. You can switch that. And lastly, it gives you the ability to just take a look to see if anything seems weird. Like awareness of a brand that you know is going to be extremely high. What if it's really low? Maybe there's just something weird with the audience you reached out to and you actually are in a targeted group instead of a non-targeted group. It just allows you to catch this stuff before it's too late. I lied, there's one more. This is just a reminder. Today we've been talking about how great it is when we triangulate our user data to our survey responses to our qualitative findings. Just ensure if that is your plan that you are including some sort of identifier that allows you to merge the data. Maybe it means like you're just trying to get a segmentation involved. You're trying to merge a segmentation. Just ensure that you have your typing tool. Just ensure that whatever you are trying to merge is included in there so that you can successfully do that and you don't realize after you've gone through all the work of fielding that you do not have that. So just in a quicker way than 45 minutes, here are the top 10 best practices for writing a good survey. It's use simple, direct, and familiar language. Be specific in your concepts and your words. Ask one question at a time. Avoid leading questions through question framing. Carefully order everything. Mitigate bias through question framing, response, and question order. Use close-ended questions. Limit survey fatigue and use logic to help. Write your questions with analysis in mind. And test, check, and soft launch. And so that kind of concludes the how to write a good survey. We did create an exercise that I will share with you all. I don't know if there are any, do we want to do questions first? No? Okay. We're going to go into the exercise. There will be plenty of time for questions. I saw you raise your hand. I will find you if you don't get to ask it. I'm just going to go right to this slide. So essentially what I've done, and I have listed out 5 metrics that we are interested in, or we want you to write a question to gauge these 5 metrics. So satisfaction of the following individual elements of your feature. These are the 3 elements. You do not have to brainstorm any other elements, but you do have to write your satisfaction scale. We have overall satisfaction of music app feature. You have to write the question and the overall scale. General listening context, a hypothesis that we're looking to test for music listening intent. We want to know the % of people opening their app for music discovery. For example, why people are opening their music app. These are the responses. You do not have to brainstorm any other ones. And then we want to know the expected update frequency of feature recommendations. So we want to know how often people expect the playlist to update with new recommendations. Your task here is to write this 5-question survey. You will have to determine the order of these. And I would say, like, to get the most out of this, we don't have a ton of time. We're going to give you 10 minutes to do this, 15 minutes to do this. Number one is just get the order down. What should be the order of these 5 questions? Number 2 is write each question in lists of responses. For things like general listening context, you can just put placeholder number 1, placeholder number 2. You don't have to actually think through, but if you would like to, by all means. And then provide any logic you think is necessary. So anchoring certain responses to the bottom. When should you randomize? When shouldn't you randomize? Keep certain responses together. How many responses should be selected? So we're really giving you guys the opportunity now to take those 10 best practices and give it a go in writing these 5 questions. And just to note, I mean, we're just calling it feature. We're not explaining what the feature is. In a survey, you should really be explaining what the feature is. Let's assume that there was a description in this survey, and now we're just calling it the feature. Any questions about the exercise? We can give you guys 10 minutes to kind of like give it your best go, talk to the person next to you. If you have any questions, I'll be around as well. All right, so for order, the first 2 questions, it actually doesn't matter which one comes first. You could have started with our, this question here, or the intent question. And the reason being is that these are the most general level questions. These are the only 2 questions that are about music app and not the specific feature itself. So starting broad and going more specific. So this was the question where the question's up top, what are people doing when they are listening? So our question text, thinking about your usage over the last month. What were you typically doing while listening to music on Music app? Prioritization, because 1 through 11 really should not matter. Now the trick, I'd ask for 12. I would be very interested to know how many people included an other option, because this is not all inclusive. Because there are 12 and we're trying to figure out like what you're typically doing, we added a select up to 4. That is the 1/3 rule for your selection variance. Now, I didn't give you the answers, so the next one will be a better, or didn't give you the responses, but in this case, I included the getting readies. I kept these together, and again, anchored at the bottom. So that question or this question, which of the following, if any, are you typically looking to do when you open your music app to listen to music? Select all that apply. The reason this is a select all that apply is because we are looking to opportunity size what these intentions are. These were the punches that were given to you. They were not given in the correct order, or they were given in a different order, but this will be randomized, but you do want to keep the ones that are very similar together. So what this will end up looking like is like these ones might be up here, they might be flipped within each other. Discover new music might fall here or here. Again, also including, there are other intentions. We did not include all of them here. And as I mentioned, it's another general question, so it would go up front. It could go first or second. Third, we had our overall satisfaction, because now we're in the feature, but we're starting more broad, so we're doing the overall satisfaction of our feature. How satisfied or dissatisfied? Remember, mitigating bias. We're going negative to positive. In my case, I did a 5-point scale. How many people went with 5-point scales instead of 7-point scales? This is our 5-point scale group. Nice. 7-point scales are also correct. The scale order, 5-point scale, I prefer 5, but it doesn't matter. Our 4th question, next we go into satisfaction of these specific elements. Notice how we're getting even more specific from overall satisfaction of the feature to individual elements. This would be, I mean, I've structured it as a grid. Again, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you? It's going to be the same scale. As long as you are using the same scale as you used in the last question, and it goes negative to positive, and it is even, and it's positives and it's negatives, you were correct in how you wrote your scale. Again, I went 5-point scale. The scale order, you are not randomizing your columns, but you can randomize these. You should randomize these because it doesn't matter how these show up. And then our last question, our expected update frequency. This is something that I chose to be very specific because I want to know what they mean by frequently. How often would you expect this playlist to update with new recommendations? And just so you know, like I did not expect you to have the exact text that I have. I've been writing surveys for many, many, many years every single day. So like this language is more intuitive to me. But it's the fifth question because it is the most specific about our feature. And had we added this before satisfaction, this question could have impacted satisfaction. Had we added this question before overall satisfaction, these could have impacted our overall satisfaction. So that brings us, kind of ends our survey writing. I'm now going to pass it over to Alex, who's going to walk through the analysis. Write your questions down if you have questions for me. Afterwards, we'll be doing our Q&A, and I can answer them then.
I'm going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully the last group of people will slowly continue to migrate over. So for the next about 30 minutes, we're going to talk about hypothesis-driven analysis. This is the last part of our kind of lecture piece of today. And basically at this point, we have all of our data. We have qualitative data. We have the data from our data and recruitment phase. We have the survey data from hopefully the great survey that Marina and her team has put together. And now what do we do with it all? So during this section, I hope that you all learn that like a lot of what we've talked about today, and this kind of recurring theme is that just like the entire research process, planning does not stop with the analysis, and actually it is a huge, huge part of the analysis. And that it's kind of like a 90-10 thing. Like good analysis is 90% about planning and 10% about execution. And when we look at each one of these kind of sections, both planning and execution, when we look at planning, I hope that you can kind of take away from this that the best analysis for our purposes here is not the fanciest, it's not the most statistically robust, perfect analysis. It's actually quite the opposite. It's the bare minimum. And I'll get into sort of a little bit more about what that means as we dig into it. And I also want to point out that in kind of when we were talking about exploratory data analysis, oftentimes the most informative analyses that we can do are the simplest ones. So what is it? With hypothesis-driven analysis, this is about leveraging all of our data streams. So all of the sort of rich data that we have collected to quantify the relationships between two variables at a time. So we could be determining if things are related, if they're correlated, so that maybe usage and hopefully usage and satisfaction go hand in hand with each other, or possibly determining if two things are different. So if we launch a new feature, trying to determine if usage changes before and after our product launch. And we're defining these relationships really so that we can make a clear and concise argument for or against a product decision. So our analysis doesn't end at there's a difference or there's a relationship, but actually carries to, goes beyond that to the storytelling of what we're seeing in our data. Click. Okay. So why are we doing this? I want to reiterate Colette's point from earlier. I think Marina also had this point. We're just going to keep kind of hammering this home, is that every method has its strengths and weaknesses. And what that means here is also that all data types, so the types of data that we collect from each one of these methods also has its strengths and weaknesses. And when you have the time and the resources and the need to really dig in, this variety of data is so helpful for being confident in our findings, being confident in our analysis choices, so that we can come back to our stakeholders with a really clear, concise, and compelling story. And as Marina touched on, there's this, qual and quant really are a symbiotic relationship. So qualitative data, or we can use quantitative data to validate hypotheses that we pull out from qual, but it's also vital that we use our qualitative data to inform our analyses as well. And I kind of touched on this, that not only does sort of data from all of these types of mixed methods help us be sort of the most confident we can in our insights. They also just makes better stories. That we can mix the qualitative insights that we gather as well as the quantitative insights that we gather. And we are going to, if we want to have impact, we need to be able to tell compelling stories with our data. And when we have a variety, it just works better. Okay, so how do we do it? At this moment, I'm not going to be doing statistics 101. I want to sort of talk with you all through the kind of like high-level approach of how I think about data and how I approach data, so that we can then actually practice. Because ultimately, the best way to develop good analysis practices, to develop good intuition for handling quantitative data, is just to practice doing it. So let's go back to our repeating theme. Let's dig into the how, and sort of this first piece, which is that's 90% planning. So an analysis plan is going to start with a set of hypotheses. And for every single hypothesis, we need to come up with a plan for how exactly we're going to test that hypothesis. And this can be a really, really enticing piece to skip, particularly when you're at a place like Spotify. And I have, lots and lots of data at my fingertips at all times. And if we were like, oh, I just want to check this thing really quick, or I really just want to kind of, dive in just for a moment, it can really kind of suck you in. And then all of a sudden you're doing all of these analyses without a plan. And I want to just like pause for a few minutes and really, really hammer home why it's so important to have this analysis plan before we start to dig in to all the rich data that we've just collected. And so, excuse me. So you need an analysis plan first to stay on track. I kind of alluded to this idea, but if we have a really great survey, if we have qualitative interview data, if we have user log data, there are literally endless ways, quite literally infinite number of ways that you could look at those data and try to cut it up in a way that's going to be interesting. And we need a plan. We need hypotheses. We need something clearly laid out ahead of time so that we stay on track, because we need to be efficient with our time. And it's so easy and so enticing, particularly as people who are really interested in human behavior and to want to just go and learn about what's going on, that we don't find ourselves down in a rabbit hole that's not going to be that important later on. The second reason that we need a plan is for insights integrity. I don't know, has anyone, or have any of you all heard of the term p-hacking? No. Oh, a few nods. Okay, good. So I'd really recommend this article. It's a BuzzFeed article about kind of how our knowledge of statistics, particularly in the social sciences, has changed dramatically over the past 5 to 10 years. And it's so common, both in academic settings as well as in industry settings, to look at your data, slice up the pie in as many ways as you possibly can, and look at data from every angle that you can imagine to see if something interesting is going on. But what's so important is that when you do this, the chance that you find something statistically significant goes through the roof. If you just cut your data up enough ways, if you look at it for long enough, if you work with it for long enough, you will find something. But that's not actually real. These are what we call false positives. And what can be dangerous is if we sort of go off the rails here and start to look at our data in this way, we can unearth and then report these false positives. And ultimately, these are going to mislead our team in the direction that we want to go. And the last part, it's so important to have a plan, is because your plan and your whole analysis needs to be collaborative. And I think that, we as researchers, I don't know, I guess I don't want to generalize. I certainly have felt this way, that if I'm looking at a question that I want to put together the most statistically and methodologically robust way to look at those data and ensure that what we're doing, or ensure that the insights that we take away are as strong as possible. But really the right way to do analysis, and why it's so important for collaboration, is because we want to be thinking about and talking about and trying to find that bare minimum analysis that we need to do in order to convince ourselves as the researcher, as well as our stakeholders, about what is actually going on. And it's impossible to find this bare minimum, this sort of perfect point of I've done just enough to convince you, but I haven't done so much that I've wasted all sorts of time. unless you're talking to your stakeholders from the very early stages. And I recognize that this might feel like an unnatural approach because you might get to the end of your analysis, and if you've only looked at your data in one way, or maybe you haven't even analyzed all of your data or all of your survey questions. I mean, theoretically, you should have the whole right with analysis in mind, but let's say you didn't. You might get to the end of your analysis and have all these questions, but what if we did this? But what if we did that? What if we looked at the data this way and not that way? I just want to emphasize that that's okay. That you can get to the end of your analysis and say, we still have these unanswered open questions. But if you are left with unanswered open questions at the end, and it's an important area that you recognize with you and your stakeholders that you need to address, you can just do this again. Create another bare minimum analysis plan and decide how you're going to go look at the data again if you need to, or possibly go collect more data. And doing this iteratively and collaboratively is going to be the most efficient way to get the most out of your data, instead of doing all of these what ifs and then realizing that you looked at 10 different what ifs and your stakeholders only cared about one, and they've been waiting for 4 weeks for your analysis and they only care about the first slide as opposed to the next 100. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox about why we need a plan. And to start to talk a little bit more about the actual sort of plan that needs to be inserted underneath hypothesis 1. So when I think about analysis planning, I think about 3 steps. First being that if we want to answer hypothesis 1, is that we need to ask ourselves, okay, in order to answer this hypothesis, what data do we need and where are we going to get it from? So we've talked this whole time about the fact that we have, in mixed methods research, we have all sorts of different data types, and we need to make sure that we have a clear mapping of what we're trying to answer and where we're getting those data from. So we might want to look at user engagement with the app, and we know that we're going to get those from user logs. Step 2 is to operationalize data into metrics. What do I mean by that? Well, user engagement is, I don't know, it makes sense. It's like we're looking to see how engaged users are with the app. But precisely what that means could be defined in a whole slew of different ways. So you might think, okay, we're going to look at the past 30 days. Your stakeholders might be used to looking at the past 7 days, or maybe the next 6 months. Maybe it's historical data versus projections. Maybe it's whether they opened the app, or maybe it's they opened the app, or it's they streamed some content for a minute or for 30 minutes until you actually count that as engagement. And so you have to align both with your other insights practitioners as well as with your stakeholders about what these more sort of colloquial ideas like user engagement actually mean when you get down to brass tacks of the metrics that you need to define. And the third step is to plan comparisons. And this is the hardest part, to be frank, because the comparisons that we want to look at and which comparisons we need to make and how we're going to make them is kind of what research and what analysis is about. And so if we kind of take this example here, I have this planned comparison looking at average engagement defined here, both before and after launch. And this is another moment where collaboration and communication with your stakeholders is really important, because you all need to agree on what a reasonable comparison is. So maybe lots of other things have launched at the same time as your feature. And if all these other things have changed, they might go, no, we can't do that. What are you talking about? Things X, Y, and Z also launched. And so any of those could be moving our metrics and you'd have no idea. And I say, okay, awesome. So what do we do about that? We start to come up with different comparisons and different ways that we need to approach the data. And so, when we're planning comparisons, like I said, this is the hardest part. This is where our plans can kind of go off the rails if we're not careful about it. And this is where really leveraging all of our data streams is so important. So we need to be, all of our planned comparisons need to be hypothesis-based. They need to be thoughtful. They need to be prioritized, right? We could come up with a whole list of 45 different comparisons, but really what we want are ones that are based on the data that we already have, whether that's from qual, whether that's from the exploratory data analysis we did in step 1, or whether it's from stakeholder there's this fine line between like listening to your stakeholders and ensuring that you're leveraging their prior knowledge to make sure that you're looking at the data in a good way versus just answering every little thing that they want to look at. And I think that gets down to prioritization again. And so we have an analysis plan. So now we have some planned comparisons put in here, just kind of generally, but they're there. Then someone still needs to execute. And I say someone because analysis is 90% about planning. If you create a clear and cohesive analysis plan and tell somebody exactly what needs to happen, what comparisons you want, what statistics to be looking at, then they can just plug away and do it. So if you have that resource available to you, you can just hand over a good plan to any data analyst and they can just deliver something back to you, which is awesome. But let's assume right now that you all are digging into the data yourself. So what does that execution look like in an ideal version, really? So when we talk about execution, I'm still going to go back to this idea of a bare minimum. So proper execution starts with a bare minimum analysis plan. And when we are looking at our bare minimum analysis, when we moved from exploratory data analysis, when we go to hypothesis-driven analysis, it's going to get a little bit more complicated, but not that much. Instead of one variable at a time, we're going to look at two variables at a time. We're still going to be looking at descriptive statistics and histograms primarily. And because we're looking at two variables at a time, we need to start to ask ourselves, how do we define and quantify the relationships between those variables? And so, when I think about hypothesis-driven analysis, my kind of high-level approach is sort of takes 3 steps. My first question, always will be, can I see it? It takes some practice to build this intuition, but the most convincing argument, honestly, that a relationship exists between two variables is to be able to show it and say, and people can see it with their naked eye. If you show a scatter plot and there's a group here and a group way over there, it's pretty easy to say that they're different. And we really do not want to jump right from I have all this data to I have all these statistical tests of this is significant, this isn't significant, this is, this isn't, this is. And the reason, if you skip past step 1, it can get you into all sorts of trouble. And I think a really good example of this is looking at scatter plots. So if we look at our data, let's assume that the x-axis down here is user engagement and the y-axis is satisfaction. So if our data looked like A, that would suggest that there's a strong linear relationship, that as satisfaction goes up, user engagement goes up. If we looked at B, which hopefully wouldn't be the case, this would be kind of odd given the two variables I just said, that if B shows a negative linear relationship, that as usage goes up, satisfaction goes down. That would make no sense, it would be a problem, but this is an example. And then what I want to point out, so what's kind of, it might be a little bit hard to see because the font is small, but underneath each graph, there's a value called R, which is a correlation coefficient. R can range between -1 and 1, where it both sort of how close you get to 1 or -1 represents both the direction and strength of that relationship. So if two variables have nothing to do with each other, we'd see this just point of clouds, cloud of points, there we go, in C. And R, the correlation coefficient, would be 0, saying that there's no relationship and nothing's going on here. If we look at D and E, we can see very obvious, very clear relationships between these two variables that are just nonlinear, they're actually curved. So D is, I guess, inverted U-shaped or parabolic, and E is U-shaped. What's really important is that if you look at the correlation coefficients at the bottom, they're all 0 on this bottom row. And so what happens so often is that we jump right into the statistics and we don't look at our data first. D and E have really obvious relationships that we can see clearly and can just show and say, hey, these are related. But if you looked just at the correlation coefficient, you would completely miss that. So this is straight out of a textbook, like literally. So let's look at slightly messier data. And we can look at our tables again. And instead of looking at one variable, we're just looking at two. And here we have two variables. So variable 1 is our grouping variable. So maybe this is before and after. Maybe this is users in one area of the country versus another. And we have our two columns with our two groups, and we have our we have our descriptive statistics about change week over week. So I might ask, how often do users come in on week 2 minus how often users come in on week 1? So it's just engagement minus engagement. And when I look at this, I'm looking for 2 things. I'm looking at the central tendency, and I'm looking at the distributions. If we look at the mean and the median, which is 50%, things look a little bit different, right? The mean for group A is a little bit higher. The median is also higher. But when I look at the standard deviation, I see that there's a reasonably wide spread. So this variable can only take on values between -7 and 7. And my standard deviation is 2.5, or I don't know, 2.25. And that's quite big. And so, I think that there might be something going on here, but again, I'm totally not sure. So the next thing I will do, who knows what I'm going to do next? Thought I saw a hand. No? I heard it mumbled. Show it. How would I show it? Graph, yes. Histograms. We could do this as a scatter plot too. I personally really like overlapping histograms. And so what we can do is we can look at the same thing. So on the x-axis is the total range of values from -7 to 7, because that's the change that could occur. So somebody could come in at 0 days on 1 week and then 7 days the next. They'd take on a value of 7. Some users could come in 7 days the week before, and then 0 the next week, and that would take on a value of -7. And then when we look at the y-axis, that's users, actually expressed as a density, so a proportion of all users, because group A and group B are different sizes. And when I look at this, I can see, first of all, that if we look in the middle and we think about group A, there are fewer users who have this 0 change. So there are fewer users that are in our 0 bucket, which means that fewer users don't change week over week. It's kind of a double negative. And then when we look at our sort of more positive bins where users are coming in app more often, they are all higher than group A. So what I'm seeing is that fewer users are in the 0 bin and more users are in the bins, 1+. And so in my mind, something, again, I'm kind of asking myself, something seems like it's going on here, but I'm not entirely sure if this is meaningful, or if this is true, if this is reliable. And that's where statistical significance testing comes in. I unfortunately can't go into all of the depth of statistical significance testing. There is a lot there, but what I really, really want to stress is that statistical significance testing is for confirming what you as the analyst can see ideally with your naked eye. When we're talking about 2 variables at a time, it should look like something is going on before you ask yourself, okay, is this statistically significant? And so I'm curious. Well, actually, here, I do want to point out too, that while we're not going to dig in, I do really like these two resources. So one is from UCLA Statistical Consulting, where they help you basically choose a statistical test given the types of data that you're looking at. And the second is a group called Layered Statistics. And they are actually, it's technically a subscription that you can pay for. But they also have free previews of a lot of their stuff. So if you just type in like layered, one-way ANOVA, they give really detailed and I think accessible explanations of how to use something like an ANOVA, when you use it, why, what the assumptions are, what you need to look out for. But just to, I don't know, get a gut check. If you all had to guess, so if this is for all of our users? I think this is for 20,000 users. Do you think that the difference between group A and group B, if you had to guess, was statistically significant? Or do you think that it's not statistically significant? So let's do a sit stand. So if you think that the difference between group A and group B is not significantly different, I'll ask you to stand up. If you think that the difference between group A and group B is significantly different, then stay seated. Uh, 20,000. A stands. Yeah? Good. Awesome. Brave souls. I appreciate it. One thing that's bad about this version is that if you're just choosing to not answer the question, I can't tell if you're answering B or you're like, I'm not going to do it. So thank you for those that stood up. I don't know if I appreciate the boldness. I don't know how much I trust the people who sat down. I should have asked the B stand up. So these are statistically significant. And like I said, we didn't run any tests. I was just kind of gut checking. I was just curious what people thought. But when we look at histograms like this, the way that we think about statistical significance is basically the less these two overlap, the more likely they are to be significantly different. And the more observations that we have, so that was a great question in the back, thank you. The more observations we have, the more users that we're talking about, the more likely differences like this are to be statistically significant. If this were 20 users, this would never be statistically significant. I can't do that. Significantly different. But because we have 20,000, when we start to move, when the shape of our distribution starts to change, that's when we start to think, okay, something's going on. I think this could be statistically significantly different. But it's important to note, I want to highlight, that the value of determining and reporting statistical significance kind of varies, depending on the number of users that you're talking about and the type of data that you're using. So for example, with survey data, let's say if we have 600 people who responded to our survey, showing statistical significance with the results that we have is pretty important to be confident about what's going on. But if you're using user log data, like I'm more I use more often, these types of histograms will have millions of users in them. And even if the difference is just minuscule and you can barely see a difference, because we have so many observations, kind of everything is statistically significant. And so if we're looking at our analysis and every single thing is statistically significant, then there's not a whole lot of value in reporting that it is. It doesn't tell us anything about what's going on. And in these moments, we have to ask ourselves, actually really in all moments, we have to ask ourselves sort of, is the relationship that we've observed meaningful? And when I say meaningful, it's actually pretty subjective as to what meaningful means. It completely depends on your product, on your team, what they care about. It's kind of asking ourselves the questions like, is this difference or is this strength of relationship big enough for us to care about or to act on? And so we might say that after launch, engagement went from 4.5 to 4.6 days a month. And this 3% relative increase is statistically significant. But does that matter? Does that change what we care about? Does that change how stakeholders think about what's going on or our feature? And the answer is, it depends. And the ways that we can start to ask ourselves and start to kind of push the question of, is it meaningful? I just have sort of 3 examples in terms of how I've thought about it. The first can be relative lift, given effort. So a 3% lift could be terrible. If we've changed our entire product, we spent months of engineering resources on this new feature, and this barely changed. That'd be a huge problem. But let's say it's a personalization algorithm, and some engineer spent 30 seconds, was like, what if I do this? And just tweak some parameter. And then all of a sudden, lift goes up 3%. That'd be insane. That'd be awesome. Another way we can think about this is sort of taking our results from our test and trying to estimate the opportunity size. So if we said that amongst our 600 users, this went up, this is a small lift, what would that look like in terms of engagement over the course of an entire year? Rolled out to all of our users. How could we actually, how big is this when we put this on the scale of what our stakeholders might be more sort of in a more common way to think about this? So not as it's statistically significant, but if we roll this thing out, how much more engagement will we see over the course of a year? And how will that change the metrics that they care about? So taking our statistical significance and turning it into a story that's more consumable for the people who we're sending this research to. And the last, I think, too, it's kind of along those same veins, is you can represent this difference, this opportunity size in terms of different KPIs. So if we're talking about engagement, but the stakeholder that we're sending this to actually cares about revenue, then try to estimate that opportunity, not as a function of engagement, but if we change engagement and then we can layer on ad revenue or something on top of that, then we can demonstrate the meaning of our test or the meaning of this difference as a function of revenue, as opposed to this difference is statistically significantly different. So once we've executed our analysis plan on all of our hypotheses, we now have an analysis report. This is really useful for you as the researcher and to communicate with other sort of insights practitioners. You have a very clear, sort of concise, everything matches one-to-one. But ultimately, we want to take our analysis report and turn it into recommendations so that we can take our insights from our analysis report and basically use them as justification for what we think that the product team should do or not do. And I want to highlight down here that recommendation 3 is more research on something else. And when we're talking about bare minimum analysis, we're talking about efficiency. There's always going to be, there probably always is going to be a recommendation to dig in deeper somewhere, and that's good because you want to demonstrate that we're pushing the needle forward, but there's still a lot to learn, and that given everything up here, if we invest here, something good is going to happen. So we've just gone through this. How are we doing on time? It's got time. Time check. Okay. All right. Did my best. Talked about basic approach. Talked about kind of high level what the way that I think about data and the way that I hope you all approach it. But the best way to learn how to do data analysis is to do data analysis. So what I'd love for us all to do is we're going to head over to the picnic tables. We're going to split up into groups of picnic table size. And we're going to go through this workbook as if we're all in school again. And included in this workbook are 3 sections on exploratory data analysis and actually looking at the data that we might have pulled earlier, a little exercise on analysis planning, and a little exercise on going through an analysis report. You probably will not have time to finish this all. There's actually even exercises if you're like, this is too easy, I don't want to do harder stuff. It's all in there. Please do not divide and conquer. I don't care if you finish one part or if you finish all 3. I really want you all to have a discussion about sort of each part in each phase. So, dig in as a group to each piece. And so I think, where'd Alec go? Or Colette? We need to send it over at Slack. Have we already done that? Okay. Okay, so if you all could head over to the picnic tables, we're going to send it via Slack where you all can download this workbook, make a copy of it for yourselves, and start to work through. Let's just wrap up our quant analysis piece, and then we will get into some Q&A. So thank you all so much for, like I said, humoring me with that worksheet as if we're back in school. I hope that it was challenging and interesting. There is an answer key. Like I said, I made up all of the data, so there are correct answers. And we will send that out probably at the end of the day so that you all can take a look through. If you're interested, there were sort of more challenge exercises down at the bottom, both looking at sort of, going through the entire process yourself with some curated data that I've visualized for you. Or if you really want to take it to the next level, all of the raw data are linked in there. And there's all sorts of weird things going on in those data. So if you want to start messing with it on Google Sheets, practicing a little bit of visualization, that's all available for you. So with our sort of typical wrap-up slide, hypothesis-driven analysis is all about leveraging all of our data streams so that we can make a clear and concise argument for or against a product decision. It's 90% planning, 10% execution. And when we look at our planning column here, we want to answer, or we want to do 3 things, or kind of 3 steps to this. Identify what data we need to test our hypothesis and where we're getting it from. We need to operationalize those metrics, or operationalize those data into metrics so we have a very clear definition of exactly what we're talking about when we say something like satisfaction or we say something like user engagement, and that we plan our comparisons carefully and prioritize. We don't want to go off the rails with too many planned comparisons. And then when we are executing, if we're the ones doing it, or really if somebody else is doing it, this is what they should be doing, is asking themselves, can I see it when I visualize those data? Once we have visualized those data, is it statistically significant? And then, but importantly, not stopping there and asking ourselves and asking our stakeholders, is this something meaningful? Stakeholders do not care if it's statistically significant. They care about meaning, and that might be represented in terms of a metric or in terms of an opportunity size. So we are wrapping the entire day up and all of this content. We hope that throughout the day, you took away the purpose of Quant UR and the powers that it can bring to quantitative methodology, mixed methods research, and that you all have sort of seen some good examples and some great ways to leverage quantitative methods in your research. We hope you feel more confident tackling them. And even if you don't, I heard one person said, I'm trying to remember how to do math, which I totally feel, that you have a strong starting point at which to decide to build on this and to learn more, or that you just have the language and the right questions to ask of your quantitative partners to go do this stuff for you, because that's also really useful too. And there's plenty of time for questions. So now we're going to jump in to Q&A. I'm going to take this off because GIFs are pretty distracting. It's kind of the point, actually. Fun fact, neuroscience fact about GIFs is that people are really drawn to motion. So if you put GIFs on the screen, they're really hard to turn away from. So if you want to get people's attention, put a GIF. If you want people to look at a graph, do not have a GIF on the screen.